A young man with light-colored hair smirks deviously, sarcastically praising another young man for making it so far into his journey. His opponent, a young man with dark hair, counters that he would absolutely not let him do as he pleases with their world. A young woman backs him up. Their exchange is watched by a man in front of a computer screen. The two young men and the young woman fighting were characters in a video game. As their battle eventually takes place, the man in front of the computer breathes hard, clicking his mouse to catch up. The young woman, named Alina, uses love magic to support Albert, the dark-haired young man. With Alina's help, Albert's combat power increased by 50%. That's one crazy buff, by the way. Additional 50% combat power is nuts. Using a powerful jab, Albert's sword goes through his opponent's torso. And with that final attack, Albert's opponent, the light-haired young man named Vento, was defeated. Albert throws his arms open in victory as his female comrades come rushing towards him, overjoyed with their win. The scene changes and it's a shot of Albert and his companions watching over the kingdom as triumphant music plays in the background. From the other side of the screen, the man playing the video game also yells in triumph as he celebrates clearing the game. He eventually calms down and says that the video game was awesome. As the credits roll out and the theme music continues to play, he tells himself that it was worth sacrificing almost his entire summer break. The game was called Fairies of Fantasia, the talked-about masterpiece eroge. Eroge is the Japanese term for games with rather explicit scenes. With an average total playtime approaching 200 hours, a player could enjoy romancing numerous heroines with a refined combat system. The biggest reason for the extended playtime is the large number of routes. Naturally, there were as many routes as there were heroines, but they increased even further depending on the faction the player chooses to join and the other choices they make. The man had used his entire university summer break to conquer every route, but it really took a long time. He especially took time with the routes where the villain Vento Raishutaria held power, finding them rather tough. However, in the end it was all still fun for him, so he had no regrets. As he turns back to the monitor, the end screen appears once more. He sits up excitedly to see the cutscene for the true ending. However, just as he does so, his vision begins to swim. His eyes roll back and he falls out of his chair and into the floor, completely out cold. Unbeknownst to him, the screen had changed once more. A message had appeared, welcoming him into their world. Somewhere, in a grand mansion, a young man shrieks as he wakes up. He sits up quickly, shocking the butler beside him. In a rush, the butler calls out to the young man, who was apparently Vento himself, making sure that he had truly woken up. Rather confused, Vento asks the butler where he was. The butler tells him that he was in his own room. He explains that Vento was hit in the head by a vase dropped by a maid and had been bedridden for about 3 days. His words just make Vento confused, and he asks the butler if he was sure that he was talking to him. The butler starts to panic as he comes to the conclusion that Vento's memories were confused. Vento looks around the room once more. The decorations around there and the bed frame made him feel like he saw them often in Fairies of Fantasia. If he was right, he was in the hated villain noble's room. He turns his head and comes face to face with a mirror. His mouth opens in horror. He immediately stumbles out of bed, much to the old butler's confusion. Vento hurriedly heads to the vanity mirror, in complete disbelief. He couldn't understand what was happening and what it meant. The man was horrified to discover that he had become Vento. Oblivious to the current Vento's panic, the old butler asks what kind of punishment he decided to hand out to the maid who dropped the vase on his head. According to him, they currently had her confined in the torture chamber, but he's cut off by Vento. In a frenzy, Vento exclaims that now wasn't the time for that. The butler says that they couldn't just keep her locked up forever either. Vento whips his head around quickly and orders him to just release her. The butler is unsure about his decision and asks if he was certain, but Vento just orders him not to ask any more weird questions. The butler immediately bows in respect, apologizing for his rudeness before quickly making his escape. Left alone, Vento starts to panic once more at the realization that he had become the hated noble. He was once the man playing Fairies of Fantasia. He was sure he was watching the end credits of the game just a moment ago, and before he knew it, he had somehow lost consciousness. His eyes widen as he remembers the last thing he saw on the screen. With horror, he slowly realizes that he really did enter the world of Fairies of Fantasia. He swallows nervously and turns back to the mirror. Even though he finally came to the game world, he couldn't be happy. His voice rings out across the whole mansion as he yells why he had to be Vento of all people. Eventually, Vento finds himself in the garden, quietly reading a book. In Fairies of Fantasia, Vento Raishutaria was a rival character to the protagonist, Albert. He was a scumbag terribly hated by the players. He tries to force himself on the other heroines. That alone completely explains why he's hated. He tried to trap and kill Albert, and if that wasn't enough, he sells his soul to Albert's arch-enemy to plot overthrowing the state. He truly had no redeeming qualities. The cause is that the family name Raishutaria was powerful, so he grew up with unnecessary pride from a young age, but his chances of survival in any route was zero. No matter which of the 6 heroines' routes the player entered, nothing but a gruesome death awaited Vento. His mood steadily worsening, Vento closes the book he was reading in annoyance. He finally made it to the world of Fairies of Fantasia. He had no plans of dying so easily. Holding out a hand, Vento summons a ball of fire. As he juggles the flame mindlessly, Vento thinks about his options. The troublesome part about Vento's characters was that he was excessively blessed with talent for magic and swordsmanship. As a player, he used to find it extremely annoying, but now that he was Vento himself, he was actually rather grateful. A few months from now, Vento was set to enroll in the Isaac Magic Knight Academy in the royal capital. He would meet Albert there, but until then he had to become even a little stronger, because the one who kills him in the game was the protagonist. His mind made up, Vento gets up from his seat and leaves the garden. He walks down the mansion corridors deep in thought. In the game, on the day of the entrance ceremony, Vento bumps into Albert. Angered, Vento challenges Albert to a duel but loses. Of course, the current Vento had no plans of doing so. Albert levels up at the academy and eventually becomes strong enough to fight evenly with the Demon King. Vento also becomes strong enough to be the final boss depending on the route, but since he'll eventually be killed by Albert, he has to become much stronger. Still lost in his thoughts, Vento goes to turn a corner when a maid suddenly appears. Before any of them could dodge, Vento bumps into the maid, sending her tumbling down with her tray of tea. She's shocked to see that it was Vento and she quickly apologizes. However, her eyes drift to his clothes, which were now stained by the tea she dropped. Immediately, her expression morphs into panic and fear. She throws herself into the ground and begs for mercy, asking him not to behead her. Vento gapes in shock. Vento is confused that she had immediately jumped to the idea of being beheaded, especially since his clothes were dirtied and nothing more. Quickly changing topics, he orders her to prepare a change of clothes since it was unsightly to stay the way he was. The maid raises her head in surprise, tears already falling down her eyes, and she makes sure that he truly did not plan on having her killed. Vento repeats himself, saying that it wasn't a grave sin. If she understood already, he orders her again to get up and get him a change of clothes. The maid bows her head again in apology, and Vento watches with concern as she hurries away. Seeing her reaction to him tells him enough just how many evil deeds the original Vento had committed until now. His change in attitude might cause suspicion, but he had to lower the probability of a bad end, even if only a little bit. However, suddenly, a strict-looking noble appears before him. With sharp eyes, the man asks him what happened to his clothes. Vento quickly explains that he spilled some tea, so he had a maid go fetch him a change of clothes. The man suddenly says that he's heard rumors that Vento had recently started being kinder to the servants, and he asks Vento if it was true. Completely bold-faced, Vento says that he had no particular awareness of something like that. He tells the man that in order to achieve excellent grades at Isaac Magic Knight Academy, he had increased his training time recently. The man frowns, asking if he meant to say that time spent minding the servants was a waste of time, and Vento agrees. The man pauses for a moment, but he eventually accepts Vento's explanation. He passes by Vento, but just as he does so, he reminds him that he was the eldest son of the REINCARNATED family. He should possess the self-awareness of being special from birth and should behave in a manner befitting their name. Vento agrees, and the man finds his answer acceptable, leaving him alone in the hallway. As he walks away, Vento casts a glance behind him. The man was Vento's father, Halberd REINCARNATED. Typical of a villain's parent, he was a nasty man. Eventually, due to Vento's influence, his embezzlement of taxes gets exposed and he falls from grace. However, since Vento was trying to rehabilitate the way he was doing at the moment, the future he knew might not come. If that was the case, he could just use Halberd, but he would have to think about it another time. For now, he decides to study magic diligently once more. Time passes. Days where he can't let his guard down continue in order to avoid the death route. However, the joy of learning things such as magic and swordsmanship that didn't exist in modern times could be called his only healing in his current world. Eventually, it was time for him to enter the academy. Standing before the school, the expression on Vento's face is full of concern. The day had finally come. He needed to calm down. In the game, Vento bumps into Albert right there and they end up on bad terms right away. In that case, if he just spent time not bumping into him in the first place, then he would be fine. He takes a step forward into school grounds and almost immediately he bumps into a familiar student's back face first. Love that he immediately failed the first step. Vento and the other student exclaim in shock. A nearby female student just as surprised as them. The student turns to face him, his expression concerned. He quickly apologizes and explains that he just came from the countryside and had never seen such a big building. The student asks if he was hurt. Vento holds onto his face, reassuring the young man that he was fine, but his expression is anything but amused. Just as he thought, it was Albert. Immediately, Vento curses himself in his head for being so careless despite trying to be careful already. Albert is confused by his sudden silence. Around them, a crowd of watching students had gathered. They whisper to one another as they recognize Vento and his reputation, some commenting that Albert was doomed. Looking around him with a frown, Vento realizes that even in the school his bad reputation already existed. However, he knew it couldn't be helped. Somehow he would find a way to overturn the bad reputation and lead a rosy life. Smiling calmly, he turns back to Albert and reassures him again that he was fine before asking for Albert's name. Albert returns his smile and holds out a hand, introducing himself. Vento introduces himself as well and adds that since they were both new students they should get along. Albert is reassured, explaining that since he was a country bumpkin he was really anxious about his new life. However, just before they can shake hands, the girl from before who was only quietly watching slaps Vento's hand away. Vento is stunned silent. Without turning to look at him and choosing to glare at Vento, the girl tells Albert not to shake hands with someone like Vento. Albert is just as surprised at the sudden appearance of Alina. Crossing her arms and continuing to stare him down, Alina says that Vento was a genuine piece of trash and just getting involved with him will lower Albert's dignity. Rubbing the hand Alina had slapped away, Vento laughs awkwardly and comments that she was being harsh, but Alina gets mad that he called her name so familiarly. The girl was Alina Melstein, the only daughter of the famous noble Melstein family and one of the heroines of the game. For Albert, she was the first person he met coming to the city, and for the players she was a reliable character who guides them to the academy. If Vento recalled correctly, in the game Vento bought out her house and tried to make her his own. That's nasty behavior right off the bat. Vento understood that that was the reason his character was so hated. If Alina whispers something weird to Albert there, it would definitely become troublesome. With a concerned expression, Vento hesitantly apologizes about the takeover matter. Alina flinches at his words. The students watching them are equally in shock. Alina explodes at the very idea that Vento was apologizing, telling him not to joke around with her. She demands to know what he was plotting. Vento calmly explains that he wasn't plotting anything and that he wasn't in his right mind at the time. He says that he wasn't asking her to forgive him and he just wanted her to believe that he won't do anything like that anymore. Alina grits her teeth, steadily getting angrier. He tells Vento that because his family had applied so much pressure on them, her father had developed a mental illness. Realizing the gravity of his situation, Vento's face darkens to hear that the problem had gone so badly. In the main story, Alina's family wasn't talked about to that extent. Looking up at him with angry tears in her eyes, she declared that she would absolutely not forgive him and him alone. Without a moment to lose, Alina holds out a hand and casts a fireball. In a panic, Albert swears and tells Vento to dodge. However, Vento merely sighs in resignation at the realization that she wasn't going to believe him that easily. He truly had a difficult road ahead. Summoning his own ball of fire in his hand, one that seemed stronger and more solid, he aimed it directly at Alina's attack. It hits Alina's attack point blank and causes the magic to scatter. Alina and Albert gape in shock. Alina watches in disbelief as her magic fizzles out. With a calm expression, Vento repeats that he was no longer the person he was before and that just meant he will have to win her trust from then on. The crowd watches him in complete disbelief. Much to their surprise, Vento suddenly makes a run for it, choosing to retreat for the day. He runs past Alina and Albert before they have a chance to react. Still angered, Alina watches Vento run off to the main school building. She quickly turns to Albert and tells him not to get involved with Vento since he truly was the worst kind of guy. However, rather lost in thought, Albert stares at Vento's retreating form with a small smile. He tells Alina that although he didn't know much about him right now, he could only think that he was glad that he didn't have to fight Vento. Alina is confused by his words, however her face morphs to complete shock as Albert asks if Vento truly was the sort of terrible person that she thought he was. Alina turns around, unable to answer him. Looking back to where Vento had run off to, her expression is confused. It was true that something felt different, and for a second she questions if the man they just met was truly Vento. Meanwhile, Vento laughs to himself awkwardly as he nears the school building. He lightly curses himself for messing up and asks himself how he even tripped in the first place. Unbeknownst to him, Albert, Alina, and the rest of the students from before watch him go. In the main school building, the entrance ceremony eventually starts. Standing at the very front of a large audience of students was a rather old-looking man. He welcomes everyone to his academy, the Isaac Magic Knight Academy. He introduces himself as the 10th headmaster, Lucy Isaac. He says that starting that day, the students should devote themselves to their studies and lead a fun academy life at the school. As his voice continues to echo throughout the hall, somewhere in the hall, Vento observes him quietly. While being a reliable adult, he thought Lucy also had a playful side. He was a popular character that drew a female audience into playing the Eroge game, and as an ally he was supposed to be a pretty strong character, but Vento had his doubts. Activating his magic, he focuses his eyes on Lucy. Using his abilities, he could see that Lucy might be intentionally suppressing the magic power leaking out. Vento wonders if it was a countermeasure to prevent others from gauging his combat power. However, much to his surprise, Lucy's eyes suddenly land on him, a knowing smile on his face. Vento flinches, breaking his concentration. He looks away nervously, suddenly afraid. Later on, he makes his way to his classroom. He's confused to see that he and Albert were in the same class. He stares as Albert and Alina talk at the front of the class. From what he remembered, Albert's entrance exam results were poor, so he should have started in the F class. At Isaac Magic Knight Academy, there was a class system where academic standing ascended from F class to A class. The current assigned classes reflect the entrance exam results, but this changes based on performance after enrollment. However, now that he thought about it, Vento remembered something. In the original story, Vento pressures the examiner to manipulate the exam results, but since Vento in the current world was the player from before, the actual exam results are reflected. Vento starts to sweat in panic as he realizes that the timeline has already changed significantly. However, his thoughts are cut short when someone calls out his name. He looks up to see a student coming towards him. It was Albert. With a kind smile, Albert says that he couldn't greet him properly earlier, so he thought he'd do it now. Again, he introduces himself as Albert. He adds that he came from the countryside and he didn't know much about things in the royal capital, but he'd be happy if they got along. Again, the students around them break into nervous whispers. They notice that Albert didn't have a family name, meaning that he was a commoner. They wonder why a guy like him was in a class, but more importantly, he was talking to Vento, the rumored tyrant. For all their whispering, Vento could hear everyone perfectly. Returning his kind smile, Vento introduces himself again, and before the shock of the whole class, he shakes Albert's hand. The crowd bursts into more nervous whispering at their exchange. They knew that the eldest son of the Reshutaria family was famous for hating commoners. They start thinking that Vento was surely planning on making Albert his slave or something similar. Some of them have heard that Vento would burn villages to get what he wanted. They were sure that Albert was finished. Vento, listening to their words, slightly agrees that if it was the Vento from before, he probably would have easily burned down a village or two. Vento looks down at his hand, still shaking Albert's. He smiles in discomfort as he looks at Albert and the aura he was emitting. Albert asks if there was something wrong, but Vento throws his hands up and reassures him that it was nothing. Albert's magic power wasn't hidden in the slightest, and it didn't stagnate for a second. Now that Vento had trained himself, he could understand things better, but for the original Vento, who relied purely on talent and slacked on training, losing to Albert was only natural. His thoughts are interrupted as he hears the students around him whispering again. They whisper how Vento's smile seemed devious and it was the face of someone who had locked onto a target. Another comments that although Albert was only a commoner, it was still pitiable. For Vento, however, no matter what they said, it was definitely better to stay on good terms with Albert. His character's death flags were all triggered when he opposed Albert. In that case, if he could deepen their relationship, Vento should be able to avoid most of the routes. However, he could feel Alina glaring at him intensely. Vento forces himself not to mind it over and over. For a split second, however, Alina's expression softens to something more like confusion. Eventually, Vento finds himself walking down the school corridors. As he passes by his schoolmates, they immediately break into whispers that he can easily hear since they were all within earshot. Some call him a villain, hearing that he almost killed a servant who defied him. Another says that they heard he beat a lower-ranking noble he didn't like to the point they couldn't recover. Vento frowns. The students were gossiping about some rather outrageous stuff. However, Vento knew they actually weren't wrong. The things the original Vento had done up to now were certainly not forgivable. Even among the servants, there were many who were still terrified of him. The only evil deeds Vento did that the current one knew of were the ones mentioned in the game. Since this world now exists as reality, there must be parts that can't be explained by settings alone. He supposed that he'll have to shoulder that atonement someday. He feels a chill down his spine as more students continue to stare as he walks by and whispers behind him. He couldn't calm down. At times like this, he decides to retreat to a quiet place. He heads to a corridor without any students, large doors at the very end of the hall. He opens the doors a crack and peeks inside. Shelves and shelves of books greeted him as he walked in. He had entered the school library. Vento could get his hands on most grimoires with the power of the Reshutaria family, but as expected, a prestigious academy was still different. It was full of books he's never seen. From what he remembered, the students should be allowed to borrow up to 3 books, but there was absolutely no one inside the library. It helped that it was quiet though. As he passes by a bookshelf, a certain book catches his attention. It was the new volume of Spell Shortening Theory. He reaches out to grab it, however, as he does so, a smaller hand goes to reach for the same book. He looks down to find a female student just as shocked to see him. His eyes widened at the sight of her. He suspected as much, but he came to the library because he thought he might be able to meet her. It was his absolute favorite character, Luna Alphen. Luna says his name, making Vento flinch in shock. She asks if it really was him and Vento blushes, saying that she was correct. Internally, he sighs in relief. He almost turned into a total otaku just then. He repeats to himself over and over that right now he is Vento. However, in his heart the player inside him was crying in joy to see her. He clears his throat and asks if she was Luna Alphen. Luna lightly laughs, surprised that he remembered people's names. The player inside him continues to cry in joy at being acknowledged by her. Vento comes up with the excuse that they've seen each other at parties several times, but suddenly he takes in what she just said and asks if she thought he looked like someone with low intelligence. With a blank but terrifying stare, Luna quickly says that that wasn't what she meant. Internally, the player inside Vento swears, but he was even more giddy that he was experiencing Luna's scornful stare firsthand. Luna Alphen was another one of the heroines and fairies of Fantasia. She was the only daughter of the Alphen family, which held power equal to the Reshutaria family. She was a genuine grimoire otaku. Her scornful eyes made her emotions hard to read. The difference between her sharp tongue and her soft side was very popular. Vento's player was one of those who fell for her differing personalities. He was honestly excited when he ran into Alina too, but his absolute favorite character just hit him differently. With a blank expression, Luna asks Vento, someone who was famous for treating people like insects, if he had business in the library. Luna says that she thinks that Vento had good taste for having his eye on the book, but the one he was eyeing was the 4th volume. She asks if he'd properly read up to volume 3. Vento calmly responds that he naturally had and even had them properly lined up at home. However, since volume 4 had just come out, it was hard for him to get a hold of it. Luna says that she understood since she only finally found it now. Vento pauses for a moment before asking how long it would take for her to finish reading it. Luna explains that she transcribed books for study while she read them, so it would take about a month. Vento makes a deal with her that if she made a copy for him too, then he would let her have it. Luna asks if that was really okay. Vento says that making 2 copies was a pretty big hassle, but it was good practice, complimenting her that she was diligent. He grabs the book from the shelf and places it in her hands. Vento turns around with a wave of his hand in goodbye, asking her not to forget their promise. Luna stares at his retreating back for a moment. Before he could completely leave, she calls out for him to wait. As Vento turns around, Luna asks him what other books he's read. He's quiet for a moment before he suggests for them to take a seat to talk. Luna agrees since there was no one else in the library but them. Finding a study table in the library, they start to talk. Luna asks if he's read The Magic of Nature. Vento remembers that it was the book about how trees and stones in nature possessed magic power and natural disasters were all magic caused by them. He asks if he was right in remembering that it was theory written in the book. Luna confirms it, adding that she found getting ideas for magic from nature an interesting discussion. Originally, magic was born to freely create and manipulate all kinds of accidental phenomena. Seeking hints from nature only seemed reasonable. Relaxed, Vento leans back on his seat and agrees that what she said was true. He wonders if they'll be able to freely manipulate lightning someday too. Luna says that the current lightning magic they had just used mana to recreate pseudo-lightning. Its speed and power were top tier, but it was still no match for natural lightning. Vento agrees that it was a big challenge, especially since in the first place lightning magic was quite rare. Luna says that even if mages could use lightning, many of them didn't use it regularly due to the mana consumption. Plus, magic specialized for power and speed was monotonous and easy to dodge. Unlike water and fire magic, which could expand their effective range, even if they were inferior in power, their conversation is interrupted by the sound of the school bell. Vento is surprised that it was that time already, and Luna comments that it was too bad because she wanted to talk more. As they both get up from their seats, Vento says that although there were still some things he wanted to talk about, he couldn't exactly ignore the time to leave school and just stay behind. Luna says that she planned to come to the library every day after school. Eyes hopeful, she asks Vento if he would come again someday. Vento smiles and promises that he would since there were plenty of books he wanted to read. Internally though, he knew that the truth was that he just wanted to come see her. He wished that he could say it out loud, but in the end the protagonist of the world was still Albert. If he strangely deepened his relationship with Luna and an event not in the original story occurred, he won't be able to handle it. Although it had already deviated quite a bit from the original story. Luna says that she's been misunderstanding Vento all this time. She says that he probably wasn't as bad a person as the rumors said, much to Vento's surprise. Vento says that it was only the first day since they've properly spoken to one another, so she shouldn't trust him so easily. Luna smiles softly and reassures him that it was fine because there were no bad people at heart who loved books. Vento asks if that was really how it worked, but Luna turns away and says that they should talk again. Vento promises to do so. Unbeknownst to them, Alina had seen them together, walking down the corridors. Peeking behind a corner, she couldn't believe her eyes to see that Luna was with Vento. She couldn't understand what it meant, especially since they looked like they were getting along. She even remembered that Vento was shaking hands with a commoner like Albert. Alina asks herself if he really did turn over a new leaf, but she quickly shakes her head, telling herself that there was no way a human like him could change so easily. She frowns resolutely. She was sure that Vento was definitely plotting something, and she would absolutely expose him. It's a new day in class, and Vento sits alone at his desk as he hears his classmates whisper all around him. They point him out to one another, calling him the infamous guy with the worst personality. Some say that they were scared to be in the same class as him, and the others say that they didn't want to get involved with him. Despite hearing all of their whispering, Vento tells himself over and over to endure it until he gets used to it. So focused on ignoring them, he almost misses someone greeting him a good morning. The person asks why Vento's eyes were shut tight. Opening his eyes, he turns to the side to find that it was Albert greeting him. He returns his good morning, making Albert smile. Vento nervously asks Albert if he didn't have any negative thoughts about him. Albert seems surprised by his question, thinking about his answer. Finally, he answers that he only felt like he wanted to work hard together as friends from then on. Vento says that that wasn't what he meant, but he brushes their conversation aside. As Albert turns away to greet his other classmates, Vento thinks about how he couldn't tell if Albert was being serious or not. But now that he thought about it, it was just like in the original story. Albert had a fearless personality. Unswayed by the opinions of others, he judges everything by his own standards. That unwavering nature was what attracted the hearts of the heroines and his allies. As for Vento, he didn't want to clash with Albert, so he supposed that he wouldn't say anything unnecessary anymore. Vento snaps out of his thoughts when he hears Albert greet Alina. Alina moves towards them and returns Albert's greeting. However, when she sees Vento, she glares at him and greets him through gritted teeth. Vento returns her good morning, however he's confused. Alina was supposed to hate him, so he couldn't understand why she was acknowledging him. Her frown deepening, she takes out a sheet of paper and holds it out to him. In a loud voice, Alina declares that she was challenging Vento to an official duel. Isn't this like the first day or first week of classes? Albert is speechless and Vento is shocked. The rest of the classroom are just as caught off guard, unable to believe that Alina was calling for a duel, some thinking it was only a joke. Albert asks Vento what a duel was, and Vento explains that it was one of the systems in the academy. The duelists bet something that they couldn't yield or use it to settle disputes, and they clash their abilities against each other. Vento frowns in concern. His situation wasn't looking so good. He never thought Alina would challenge him. The flow of the story was deviating considerably from its original timeline. I think you've long since changed the story when you started being nice to everyone. Looking rather smug, Alina asks if he would accept or not. Vento asks why she was challenging him to a duel, and Alina plainly states that it was because she couldn't trust him. She says that after tormenting her family so much, she couldn't believe him even if he suddenly acted like a good person. That was why, even if it was by force, she would make sure to know who he really was. Alina says that if she won, Vento would have to apologize properly regarding the acquisition matter. Of course, he had to kneel and rub his head against the ground. I feel like if she asked nicely, he would have done it without the duel. Vento asks what he would have if he won, and Alina says that she would do whatever he said. Alina says that she was betting her life on the duel too because she couldn't protect her dignity the way it currently was. Alina continues to pressure him, saying that it was useless to refuse because she would follow him around until he accepted. Vento comments that he thought her words counted as a threat. Between them, Albert watches their exchange, unable to come up with anything to say. After a moment of silence, Vento reluctantly accepts the duel. Much to Albert's shock, Vento asks for the time and place, and Alina tells him that they'd have the duel tomorrow at the first dueling arena. Vento says that she secured a good spot. Alina says that it was rare for people to want to duel so early in the new semester, and Vento agrees with her. With that, she says that that was all she wanted to say, and she turns away to leave. Left to their own devices, Albert watches as Vento slumps into his seat with a heavy sigh. Albert asks if Vento really did try to acquire Alina's family estate. After a pause, Vento admits that he did, but he defends himself by saying that he wasn't in his right mind back then, and as of that moment, he had no intention of acquiring it. After all, he knew it was the actions of the original Vento. Internally, Vento thinks about how he already told his family to cancel the acquisition. However, he guessed that it didn't end with just that for Alina. After all, Alina nearly lost her home and family because of the original Vento. If the acquisition was called off, there was no doubt she would be saved. However, there was no way she could remain calm while someone else held power over her life and death. Whether it was taken or protected, she wanted a result that she fought for herself. Thinking about his words, Albert says that he couldn't imagine Vento using cowardly methods to trap someone. If the old Vento was a cruel and atrocious human being, then he thought that Vento had changed so much it was as if he became a different person somewhere along the way. Hearing his words, Vento hurriedly denies his theory. Albert laughs and agrees with Vento, saying that it sounded too much like a fairy tale. The moment Albert leaves, Vento's expression is completely nervous. Albert was so sharp it was scary. He couldn't even laugh at the conversation. After classes, at the Melstein estate, a butler bows low as he greets Alina's return. As Alina steps out of the carriage, she asks where her father was. The butler tells her that he was in the study. Alina makes her way through the manor and knocks on the doors of a room, announcing her arrival. A voice inside tells her to come in, and she pushes open the doors. Inside, a haggard-looking man sits at the office table. The bags under his eyes are heavy, and he lets out an exhausted sigh as he holds his head up. Concerned, Alina quickly kneels by his side. The man was her father, and Alina tells him that since he was still recovering, he shouldn't push himself. However, his father disagrees, saying that he couldn't do that. With tired eyes, he says that even though the acquisition talks had disappeared, the fortune used to prevent it, and the servants who left must be brought back. He holds on to Alina's wrists and says that there was no time for him to rest. Alina tries to argue back, but in the end she leaves the study, glancing one last time at him. Eventually she finds herself leaning on the balcony, a frown on her face. The Raishutaria family had repeatedly harassed them in order to obtain the Melstein family mansion. Because of that, her father once fell ill from the stress. Although the acquisition talk suddenly disappeared and he was gradually showing signs of recovery, her father lost physical strength and his health wouldn't return immediately. Even so, he was trying so hard to rebuild the house. Angry tears in her eyes, Alina clenches her fists as she remembers Vento. She swore to herself that she would absolutely not forgive him for messing with other people. The next day, the students find themselves in the first dueling arena. Isaac Magic Knight Academy, which exists to nurture many talents, had prepared numerous training facilities within its vast grounds. One of them was the first dueling arena. It was the largest in scale among the arenas, which went up to number 4. It was also used when deciding the rankings among students. Down in the battleground, Alina and Vento stood face to face. Arms crossed, Alina says that she appreciated that Vento came without running away. Vento calmly says that promises were meant to be kept. Between them, a referee lists the rules of the battle. He tells them that since their fight was a formal duel, they needed to have a referee. Vento and Alina are handed badges. It was a magic tool that took a fatal wound in the duelist's place once. As Vento and Alina pin the badges to their uniforms, the referee continues. Victory or defeat was decided when one surrenders or when one of the badges shatters. Other than that, if one of them flees from the arena before the match was decided or if they tormented their opponent more than necessary, it would result in a loss, so he reminds them to be careful. The referee adds that attacking after the badge was destroyed was out of the question. Vento sweats nervously at his last words as he notices the referee give him a look specifically. With that, the referee tells them to take their positions. He raises his arm and declares the start of the battle. Immediately as Vento positions his sword, his magic engulfs him completely. Alina frowns, recognizing that he was using magic reinforcement. The referee nervously looks at Vento. He's heard that the Raishutaria's eldest son was a genius, but he wasn't expecting that it would be to that extent. He couldn't believe that a student who had just enrolled already had that level of magic reinforcement. Even Alina was surprised. She knew that with her reinforcement technique she was no match yet. Close combat puts her at too much of a disadvantage. Clapping her hands together, she summons a magic circle. Flames surround her as she opens her hands. A bow and arrow made of flames materializes into her hands and she aims at Vento. Vento flinches for a second at the incoming arrow and quickly dodges. Alina's specialty magic was Flame Demon's Handplay, which utilized fire and magic modeling arts. Vento was pretty sure that that was what was written in the original game. Alina yells that she wasn't letting him escape and quickly fires more flaming arrows at him. Vento could only run around the arena as the arrows crashed at the walls behind him. At his current distance, attacks would fly at him endlessly. He needed to close the distance first. Alina clicks her tongue before tossing the bow and arrow away. As Alina switches her weapon, Vento takes this as his opportunity to strike. He quickly rushes towards her, sword in hand. He raises it into the air, but just as he does so, Alina finishes summoning her next weapon. She had created a saber made from flames and deflected his sword, but the attack knocked her back. Seeing that he successfully broke her stance, Vento presses on. He dashes back in, sword ready to strike. However, Alina throws her weapon away again and claps her hands together. With determined eyes, she summons a flaming lance, much to Vento's surprise. He quickly backs away as Alina throws the weapon at him. She had fired a spear of fire using the principles of flame magic. Vento didn't realize before how dexterous she was. Flame Demon's Handplay was an applied technique of fire attribute magic. By endowing fire, which originally had no shape, using the image and function of existing weapons, it gave it mass that shouldn't exist. By doing so, the fire became equivalent to an actual weapon, but it was still magic nonetheless. In other words, it was possible for the caster to attach commands like fly forward. The mana consumption increases by the amount of the command. Vento grits his teeth, wiping the sweat from his face. If he was honest, letting Alina put distance between them was bad. Alina summons another magic circle again. She conjures flames before striking the ground and creating flaming ballistas. The students in the audience look at the new summoned weapons and start asking one another if the fight was getting a bit too dangerous. Some comment that Alina and Vento were just on another level. Meanwhile, Alina looks down at her slightly wounded hands that were beginning to tremble. Just blocking a single one of Vento's attacks had made her arms go numb. At the rate they were going, she wouldn't be able to block many times. She knew that approaching while dodging that in the flesh would be extremely difficult. Vento is quiet as he waits for Alina's next move. Alina knew she had no choice but to keep making him keep his distance. Meanwhile, Vento takes in a resigned breath. He supposed he had no choice, he just thought it was a bit too early to debut it. Clenching his fists, magic suddenly wraps around him once more. He had the conversation with Luna the other day, but in the end, lightning was pure romance. Alina flinches to see Vento suddenly using lightning magic. She knew lightning magic was rare, but it wasn't like she didn't know how to deal with it. She just couldn't understand why he was covering himself with it. She prepares for his next move. Focusing her eyes on him, Alina knew that she just had to determine the direction it flies. At least that was the correct countermeasure for lightning magic. Lightning magic was top class in both power and speed, but it only flies in a straight line. If the user tries to bend it, the nature of lightning means there was a possibility it would be attracted to something else. But the secret to Vento's magic was that it did not fly. Using his magic that he called Kirin, the mythical beast of lightning, his magic explodes all around him. The audience is in awe of his ability. One moment he's in Alina's line of sight, but with a crackle of lightning, he disappears from her view. Alina panics as he vanishes, but before she can react, she hears his voice behind her. With a single hit to her side, Vento delivers a rush of lightning all over her. Using that single attack, the badge she carried crumbles into pieces. Amongst the audience, Albert watches in shock, seeing Albert use lightning magic. It was a fact that lightning magic couldn't achieve the same speed as actual lightning, and the fact it could only be fired in a straight line has been an eternal issue. However, it seemed that Vento had turned it into a form of reinforcement magic by using it inside his body. Everyone in the audience, including Albert, watched the battle in awe, thinking that Vento was amazing. Back in the battleground, Vento stood over Alina as she kneeled on the ground, clutching her side. With a horrified expression, she knows she lost because of her shattered badge. Just to confirm her thoughts, the referee concludes the match with Vento as the winner. Vento cancels out his magic, but as he does so, his body is wrapped in pain that he could barely hide. Since he pushed past his limits, the muscle pain was brutal. Yeah, I'd imagine so, since you basically trapped lightning in your body. Still standing over her, Vento repeats that he won. Alina turns to face him, but despite her frown, tears are gathering in her eyes. Vento is caught by surprise at the sight of Alina with tears in her eyes, raw and unfiltered. The player inside him was rather content, thinking it nice that though she normally acts stuck up, she also occasionally shows weakness. But Vento reminds himself that now wasn't the time to think like a player. Vento asks her again if the loser listens to one thing the winner says. Still feeling defeated, Alina tells him to do whatever he likes. Since she had lost to him, she didn't see any value in living anymore. Crazy words from someone who brought up the fight in the first place. Vento tells her not to say things like that. She whips her head around to face him as she points out the irony in his words. But Vento had his arms pressed to his side, bowing low at her. Alina gapes in shock. The audience is just as shocked as they watch, even Albert was left speechless. Vento says that he knew that his treatment of the Melstein family wasn't something that could be forgiven at all. He wouldn't say that he wanted her to forgive him, but he just wanted her to believe him when he said that he wouldn't harm her anymore. Alina is quiet for a moment as she watches him. She asks him if those were his orders as the winner. Standing up straight, Vento quickly waves his hands nervously, turning down her assumptions and saying that phrasing his request like that sounded bad. Alina continues to gape at him. She couldn't believe that the man in front of her was really Vento. It was as if he was a completely different person. She was used to the Vento that looked down at her and sneered, not the one in front of her who clumsily continued to try and patch things up with her. She finally stands up and crosses her arms before telling Vento that she would believe him. She continues that if she was honest, even if he said that he's turned over a new leaf, she still couldn't believe it. But she would overlook it for the sake of his eyes that looked entirely like a different person's. As for the future, it depended on his actions. Luna was also in the crowd, and she watches quietly as Vento smiles and thanks Alina, saying that her decision was alright with him. Alina tells him not to thank her and only promises that if Vento ever did something to hurt someone again, at that time she would stop him even if it costs her her life. Despite the threatening tone, Vento smiles happily and says that he understood and he would entrust his life to her. Alina is caught off guard by the expression on his face. She quickly turns around to hide her face that had gone red. She couldn't understand why she was blushing. She tells herself to calm down. Alina shakes her head to knock some sense back into herself, reminding herself that Vento was her enemy, so there was no way she would ever open his heart to him. Vento watches her in confusion. However, catching sight of his stare, Alina blushes once more before scoffing and leaving the arena first. Vento sighs in relief that everything seemed to work out somehow. Internally, though, Vento complains why he was the one who had to apologize. It wasn't like that thought never crossed his mind. He wasn't the real Vento. But if the only path left was to live as Vento, then he had no choice but to follow the life he lived, one step at a time. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to him, someone had been watching the duel through binoculars. With the lenses still watching Vento, the girl watching him, her hair a light color, comments how strange he was. According to all the stories she's heard, Vento was a villainous troublemaker. But looking at the duel and its conclusion, she thought that he seemed like a pleasant young man. She removes the binoculars from her face. The girl is surrounded by other students providing her with tea and a parasol. Behind her, a dark-haired girl arrives, saying that no one cared about his personality. What was important was whether he was strong or weak. The light-haired girl greets the dark-haired girl as Fiska, surprised by her arrival. She comments that it was rare for her to come watch someone's duel. Fiska smiles and says that she was just evaluating since there might be a strong kid among the first years. The light-haired girl asks Fiska if she intended to mess with them, and Fiska agrees. She says that Vento looked quite interesting and she'd definitely like him to play with her. The light-haired girl comments that Vento would be quite pitiful to get tangled up with Fiska, the Academy's 4th rank. Fiska laughs, saying that the other girl was making her sound bad when she really only wanted to play with strong people. The light-haired girl tells her to do as she pleases since she wouldn't particularly stop her. Fiska comments that it was rare for her upperclassmen to not lecture her over something like that. The light-haired girl says that there were various things she wanted to verify about Vento. One of them was his ability. If he was able to stop even Fiska, it would mean that his abilities were the real deal. As student council president, she wanted to gather information on dangerous factors. Fiska hums in thought. She really didn't get it, but if the other girl wasn't going to stop her, then she would do as she pleases. With a crinkle in her eyes, she tells an oblivious Vento that they would have lots of fun. Another day at school, Vento walks down the halls once more, and again students watch him pass by and whisper behind his back. He lets out a sigh once he sets his bag down on his desk. It seemed like the story of yesterday's duel had already spread. Vento was famous to begin with, so he supposed it was only natural that he stood out immediately if something happened. As he continues to stew in his thoughts, Albert comes up behind him and happily greets him good morning. Albert comments that he had completely become the man of the hour as everyone stared at him from around the class. Vento tells him that it was rather troublesome because he hasn't been able to relax all morning. Albert says that yesterday's battle was truly magnificent, adding that he was very proud to have classmates like him and Alina. Vento is caught a bit off guard by his words. But now that he thought about it, from what he remembered, Albert was a total training addict. Or it would be more accurate to say that he liked making himself stronger. Since even leveling up was fun in Fairies of Fantasia, Vento figures that there must have been parts influenced by the player's mindset too. Speaking of training addicts, Vento wonders about one of the other heroines and what she was doing at that moment. He knew she loved fighting more than anything, so she should have picked a fight with Albert at a relatively early stage. Suddenly, the class goes quiet as Alina walks into the room. She heads straight for Albert, who readily exchanges greetings with her. Stiffly turning to Vento, she also offers her greetings, which Vento returns, although awkwardly. Alina says that as she had told him yesterday, she would be monitoring him closely, and if he tried anything strange, she would stop him immediately. Vento replies that she was very welcome to, but he nervously smiles as he suddenly wonders how far her monitoring would go and if it would extend outside the academy. Their conversation is cut short when Albert throws an arm around the both of them. He says that he was glad that they had made up, adding that it made him happy when friends got along. But Alina quickly pushes the both of them off, saying that they haven't become friends. Trying to stifle a smile, Vento laughs nervously. Their conversation shifts as Albert suddenly says that there was something he wanted to ask the two of them. Clapping his hands together in a plea, Albert says that since he was raised in a village, he didn't know anything about the royal capital. So if they didn't mind, he asks them to guide him. Vento and Alina think about his request. Isaac Magic Knight Academy was built inside the royal capital of the Elfrid Kingdom. The Elfrid Kingdom was one of the most prosperous countries in the world, and even its royal capital showed a liveliness not seen in other nations. In addition to that, since it was overwhelmingly large, it was common for those who came from the countryside to get lost. Albert comes closer to Vento and continues to beg him for his help, saying that they were the only people he could rely on. Vento says that he didn't really mind. He wanted to go see Luna, but he also couldn't ignore his relationship with Albert either. Alina says that if Vento says he was going, then she had to go too, since she didn't know what he would do outside. Vento comments that she had no trust in him as usual, but Alina just counters that he promised that he was going to make her trust him from now on. Albert, oblivious to their fighting, happily thanks them for agreeing. To be able to chat with the characters of Fairies of Fantasia the way he was doing, Vento's player would have rejoiced without hesitation if only he wasn't in Vento's body. Eventually, the three of them arrive in the heart of the kingdom. Albert exclaims in amazement as he sees the royal capital for the first time. It was full of shops he'd never seen before. As Albert jogs a little ahead, Vento laughs, glad to see that he was enjoying his time sightseeing. Vento's player was excited too when he first came into the world, but since his memories were shared with the original, that feeling faded rather quickly. Full of excitement, Albert almost jumps from stall to stall, checking everything out. Vento and Alina can only watch him in concern. Alina tells Vento that people just became like that naturally when they came to the royal capital for the first time. Vento adds that even if it was obvious for them nobles, from Albert's perspective, everything must have been unknown. Vento says that it wasn't like he didn't understand that feeling of being that excited. Alina stops short at his words, and Vento turns to her in concern. Alina says that for a moment she thought he had a fever, and Vento is confused, asking her if he looked pale. Alina says that it just felt wrong to see him showing understanding towards a commoner. With a carefree smile, Vento says that status didn't matter whether someone was a commander or a noble, and he just liked good people in general. And for him, Albert was without a doubt a good person. He tells Alina to look as Albert crouches down to help a young boy that tripped. As Albert helps the teary-eyed boy stand up and smiles at him encouragingly, Vento tells Alina that that was the reason he wanted to get along with him, and that was all there was to it. Alina seems to look at Vento in a new light. However, she frowns again as she stares at him some more. It didn't seem like he had any ulterior motive. Vento suddenly turns to her, asking if there was a problem since she's been staring at him for a while now. Alina flinches at his words and immediately tries to hide the blush on her face. She defends herself in a frenzy, saying that he was misunderstanding something because she wasn't staring. She quickly turns around. Vento laughs it off, thinking that she was just being wary of him. The fact that she stopped snapping at him was already great progress. Their conversation is cut short when Albert yells out to them and calls them over towards a weapon shop. The day continues on, and pretty soon Albert has a full paper bag. He ended up buying all sorts of things. Rather concerned, Alina asks him if it was okay to buy that much, especially since there was junk mixed in too. Albert just laughs because he might have gotten too excited. Thinking that the other two couldn't see him, Vento almost cries as he witnesses a scene that was in the original game. Alina and Albert are confused by his expression, but they let it go. Their group turns around to hear screaming, someone calling for anyone's attention to stop. Two men quickly running to their direction. Two men with their faces covered and each holding a crate were dashing towards them, telling them to move out of the way. Albert calmly sets down his paper bag and asks Vento to handle one of them. The two men are caught off guard when Vento and Albert stand before them. Unable to stop in time, Vento stretches out a leg and trips one of the men, sending him and the crate he was holding down to the ground. The crystals in the crate scatter all over. The man's partner yells at him for tripping. Vento stands before them, arms crossed, and comments that they were holding merchandise. Albert says that if they quickly returned the goods to the shopkeeper, the two of them would let the men off by just turning them over to the guards. One of the men cursed at them, saying that they were getting in the way of their work. Vento is confused by his words, but before he can say anything more, the men prepare to attack. Vento and Albert stand their ground as the two men dash towards them. Albert accepts the challenge, but Vento reminds him not to overdo it too much, which Albert throws back at him. Pissed, the two men take out knives, warning them not to get in their way. Albert says that they were asking for the impossible, before Albert immediately summons his magic to wrap around him. As Vento had expected, Albert's moves were refined. One of the men charges forward, knife raised and ordering them to move. Albert swerves out of the way just in time and the man misses him, but Albert lifts his leg and kicks the man at the side. The man coughs out in pain. His partner watches him go down. He curses at them and calls them brats as he holds his knife up, but Vento blankly states that he didn't want to be called that way by trashy adults like him. The man swings his knife at Vento, but he dodges. With a hit to his wrist, Vento disarms him. He warns the man to grit his teeth as he clenches his fist and delivers a devastating blow to the enemy's face. The force of his hit was so strong that Vento's opponent bounced off of multiple objects in the alley. With the man finally lying down on the ground, out cold and with a bruised cheek, Albert asks if he did a bit too much, and Vento says that he probably did. One of the men struggled to sit up, cursing as he said that at the rate they were going they wouldn't reach their quota. Vento is confused by his words for a moment before he remembers that the men were Nirvana's underlings. Nirvana was a criminal group operating in the shadows of this world. It's the name of the so-called Dark Guild. They had summoned the god known as the evil god Avon. They are the worst kind of guild, attempting to carry out a reset of all life in the entire world. In the original storyline, after losing to Albert, Vento also joins Nirvana. A merchant suddenly comes running towards them, thanking them profusely. The merchant reaches them and says that they saved him. Albert reassures him that it was no problem before asking if his goods were safe. Looking over one of the crystals, the merchant says that they were mostly fine, although some did get chipped. Looking at the men passed out on the ground, the merchant sighs and says that they really caused a lot of trouble. He informs them that someone had called the guards so they could just leave the rest to them. The merchant thanks them again, but when he starts to offer a reward, Albert quickly raises his hand to stop him. He reassures him that it was fine and he just did what was natural. Albert turns around, calling for Alina and Vento and motioning for all of them to leave. The merchant tries to stutter out a reply as he watches them go. As they walk, Alina says that she may sound a little stingy, but she suggests that they should have at least accepted a reward. She adds that even the merchant probably wouldn't feel right. Albert reassures them again that it was fine. He says that he left the village in order to help people, so even without a reward, if that person was saved, it was more than enough for him. Albert smiles at Alina as they talk. From behind them, Vento smiles, thinking how Albert was truly a dazzling guy. Albert suddenly says that Vento might have wanted a reward, and he apologizes for deciding for everyone by turning it down. Vento reassures him that it was fine, but Alina says that in front of Albert, Vento probably had no choice but to say that, otherwise Vento would look like a greedy person. Vento immediately defends himself, saying that she didn't have to say things like that. As their group continues to talk among one another, Vento smiles in content. He didn't think that he would be able to see a scene where the three of them were laughing together. If the fans of the original work knew about them, they would probably faint. They continue to walk down the royal capital, but suddenly Vento catches sight of someone. It was a girl leading a small party of soldiers. Vento recognizes her as Melfi. Melfi Sulfuria was one of the heroines of Fairies of Fantasia and a member of the Elfrid Kingdom Knight Order. As indicated by her pointed ears, she was an elf, a race that lived together with the forest. She was searching for the culprit who destroyed the elf village where she lived. Vento knew who the culprit was, but if he told her, the main story would drastically change. He felt bad, but it was better not to say anything. Vento watches as Melfi approaches the merchant from before. Alina suddenly calls for Albert and Vento's attention, telling them that the guards were coming their way. Melfi walks towards them and asks if they were the ones who captured the men, which Albert confirms. Melfi expresses her thanks and informs them that the men had been repeating magic stone robberies around there. They were quick to flee and hard to catch, but thanks to Albert and Vento, they managed to do it. Melfi smiles warmly and thanks them again. Vento thinks how unbearable it was to know that behind her smile she harbored an extraordinary desire for revenge. He snaps out of his thoughts when Melfi asks if he was Vento Raishutaria, and Vento answers that he was. Melfi is rather amazed that he seemed more fit than she expected. From what she heard from rumors, he was an idiot son who neglected effort because of his talent and used his family's power to do whatever he pleased. Her words felt like a large weight dropped over Vento's body. He asks her if she normally said things directly to a person, and Melfi explains that she only said it because he didn't seem like that. She grins and says that she supposed that rumors really weren't reliable. The player using Vento almost cries in relief, realizing that it really was Melfi right in front of him. He already met so many of the characters already, but he couldn't get used to all of it. Melfi remembers that she had to get back to work soon and bids them all goodbye with another thanks. She turned back to them, waving goodbye as she ran. Albert tries to yell a warning, but Melfi slips on a banana peel and she tumbles to the ground. Melfi's uniform raises as she kneels on the ground, her backside showing as she groans in pain. Ah, so this is where the eroge part of the game comes in. It finally makes sense. Albert quickly runs over to her, asking if she was okay. Melfi laughs awkwardly, reassuring him that she was fine. As Vento watches her go back to the group of soldiers, he wears an awkward smile. She had the older sister element, the revenge element, and even a clumsy girl element. Melfi had it all. She was just a heap of tropes. Eventually their day ends, hitting a crossroad. Albert says that since he was staying at the dorms, they'll have to split up there. Albert says that thanks to the two of them, he learned a lot about the royal capital. Alina reminds him not to buy so much stuff, and Albert reassures her that he wouldn't. Vento bids him goodbye and Albert gives him a wave, saying that they'd see each other at the academy again. Alina and Vento walk away together, quietly making their way home. However, Vento starts to sweat nervously at the awkward atmosphere. He couldn't help but think that things were definitely awkward when it was just the two of them left. Suddenly, Alina calls out to him. Vento involuntarily flinches, his voice too polite, making Alina ask why he had suddenly started being formal with her. After a short pause, she says that she thought today was actually pretty fun, shocking Vento. Alina says that it was still hard to fully trust him, but at least today wasn't a bad day. Scratching the back of his head, Vento says that he was glad to hear her words. However, Alina reminds him that it didn't mean she was lowering her guard around him. Vento reassures her that he understood. Another day at school, their magicology class ends, and the teacher leaves the room soon after. Vento stretches his body before slumping back into this table. He liked studying magic, but when it came to classes, he found them to be a drag. However, if he started slacking off, Luna would surely despise him. So for now, he decides to treat it as a review and just do it. His thoughts are cut off when Albert appears in his line of vision. Startled, he immediately gets up from his chair and asks what was up. Albert asks him if he wanted to train together at the training ground. Albert says that since Vento seemed knowledgeable about magic, he wanted him to teach him a couple of things. Albert holds out a hand in welcome to Vento, Alina behind him waiting patiently for his answer. Vento wonders if Alina was forcibly invited by Albert. Revealing his hand to Albert wasn't very desirable. The possibility of facing him in the future wasn't zero after all. He frowns, deep in thought. Finally, he apologizes to Albert and says that he had plans today, but he offers to come with them tomorrow. Albert thinks about it for a moment, but he agrees. Vento apologizes for the change in plans, but Albert reassures him that he was the one who suddenly invited him in the first place. Throughout their conversation, Alina's eyes are trained on Vento. Eventually, he feels her stare and turns to ask her if she wanted to say something. Alina asks him if he was planning to commit some evil deed while she wasn't looking. Immediately, Vento jumps to his own defense, saying that that would be impossible. Alina says that she was just kidding. Vento tells her that there were jokes she should and shouldn't tell. Albert tries to mediate between the two of them as Vento breathes heavily from the panic he just felt. Vento suddenly stops. He noticed that it didn't feel like the relationship between Alina and Albert was deepening. It should be about time for each heroine to start getting close to Albert, but things didn't seem to be working like that. From outside the class, footsteps near the room. In the original game, Albert was always flocked by the other heroines. But right now, Albert was going at his own pace as usual. Vento wonders if Albert even planned on trying to woo the heroines. Vento stares hard at Albert, making Albert rather uncomfortable. Suddenly, the door to the classroom opens and a female student walks in. She greets Vento's group, saying that she couldn't help but come see him herself. Vento, Albert, and Alina are shocked at the sudden intrusion. However, Albert only asks who she was, making Alina exclaim in panic, unaware that Albert didn't know who she was. Alina says that the girl was numbers 4, Fiska Uel. Albert looks shocked for a moment before he turns back to Alina and asks what numbers were. Alina yells at him, unable to believe that he was in the academy but had no idea what the concept of numbers were. Numbers was a title given to students ranked in the top 10 of the academy hierarchy. The moment a student becomes one of the numbers, their name is known to every student in the academy, which appears to be a lie since Albert didn't even know who she was. Alina says that everyone was aiming for those top 10 spots, and yet Albert didn't have a clue what it meant. Albert manages a weak laugh, making Alina even angrier that he didn't understand a single thing she said. Vento's player internally cries again for witnessing one of the scenes in the original game. Fiska visiting the classroom was also just like in the original. The only difference was that Vento was in the room with them. With a small smile, Fiska swipes her arm and sends an object flying. Vento flinches to realize that she had thrown the sword in her hands at him, missing him by inches and lodging itself on the chalkboard between him and Albert. In Fiska UEL's second year, she climbed all the way to numbers 4. She had a troublesome personality where she was dying to fight strong opponents. She was also known as a complete battle maniac. In the original game, she got interested in Albert, who defeated Vento and started messing with him. As expected, Albert was following the path of the main story. However, Vento's confused. In his current world, Albert hadn't dueled anyone yet, so it didn't make sense that Fiska would get interested. Albert makes the first move, asking their senior Fiska if she had any business with them. Fiska moves forward, agreeing that she did have business with them. However, she completely passes by Albert and moves to Vento. She says that she just wanted to say hello to the rumored new student. Looking up at Vento, Fiska's voice is dark as she asks Vento if he wants to duel with her. Vento is completely caught off guard by her sudden interest. Before he can say anything, Fiska pulls her arm back, ready to throw a punch at him. Damn, she doesn't plan on holding back. As Fiska's fist draws near, Vento holds out his hands in front of him to catch her attack, using magic to strengthen his block. However, at that distance, he's still most likely to get socked in the jaw, in my opinion. Fiska's attack hits Vento's palms with a powerful echo. Vento notices that Fiska's fist is enveloped with magic. He grits his teeth in panic at the realization that Fiska had used proper magic reinforcement to accompany her punch. Fiska grins in fascination at Vento, thrilled at his quick reflexes. She quickly twists her body around before raising her leg to deliver a high kick. Her foot slams against Vento's crossed arms, both using magic reinforcement to strengthen their offense and defense. Vento grits his teeth at the strain of catching a heavy attack instantly, but Fiska just laughs in joy, amazed that Vento could block her close combat attacks. However, a voice cuts in, telling their upperclassmen that she's done enough. Fiska hums in confusion at the sudden intrusion. Albert and Alina had braced themselves to fight her, using their own magic to reinforce themselves. With a focused expression, Alina reminds Fiska that they were still in a classroom, the other students behind her cowering in panic and fear. Alina asks her not to go wild in the class. However, Fiska's expression just twists into a dark grin at the sight of them, ignoring Alina's words and choosing to say that since the two of them looked pretty good as well, she could have more fun. Alina and Albert flinch, a chill running down their spine. Meanwhile, with Fiska momentarily distracted, Vento tries to plan out a strategy. He couldn't believe that he ended up being Fiska's target instead. Vento was making one miscalculation after another. He frowns, not sure what to do next. Seeing the panicked students and Albert and Alina still preparing to attack, Fiska sarcastically apologizes. She says that she guesses it was a bit lacking in common sense to suddenly attack Vento in a classroom. She turns back to Vento, her expression more calm now, and explains that she just really wanted to try fighting him. She smiles and says that she just couldn't help it. Suddenly, she crosses the short distance between her and Vento and excitedly looks up at him. She says that if they couldn't fight in the classroom, then they could do it in the dueling grounds. With twinkling eyes, she tries to convince him that he would have a blast dueling her. Vento flinches back at her sudden closeness. The classroom seems to go completely quiet as he slowly says that he refused to duel with her. Fiska's eyes can only open wide in shock, not sure if she heard right. With more determination, Vento says that he had no reason to duel her. He offers a half-hearted apology and says that he wasn't the type of person who enjoyed fighting. Without a second to lose, he passes by Fiska and speeds out of the classroom door with a short goodbye. Gotta love that his tactic for every confrontation is to immediately book it. Fiska quickly turns around, flusteredly telling him to wait, but he is already gone. Fiska and the rest of the class are struck silent for a moment, but soon Fiska is grabbing her sword, convinced that Vento was just playing a game of tag. Don't know how she got to that conclusion, but hey, I guess if it works. With full determination, she runs out the classroom and bursts into the school corridors, hell-bent on catching up to Vento. As the rest of the class quickly turn away now that the disruption is gone, Albert and Alina are the only ones left speechless. Facing where Fiska and Vento had just disappeared off to, Albert asks what just happened, but Alina is just as confused by the whole event. Meanwhile, Vento silently walks down one of the corridors of the school. He supposed he would head to the library until things cooled down. He tells himself that he already had a duel and he could afford not to have them again and again. However, his senses are on high alert all of a sudden. He turns around to see a swift figure quickly making its way towards him. He almost couldn't believe it, but the person getting closer was none other than Fiska. With a terrifying look in her eyes, she's overjoyed to see that she had finally found him. As she runs, she tries to convince Vento to duel her again. Vento tries to dash away, remembering in the back of his head that he was told not to run in the hallways, but desperate times called for desperate measures. Without a moment to lose, he activates his Kirin abilities. With a renewed boost in magic, Vento uses it to make himself go faster. He runs past corridors and more students, but Fiska remains hot in his tails. As expected of one of the numbers, she was on a whole other level. He couldn't believe that she was keeping up with his Kirin. Fiska had reinforcement magic from immense mana, pure physical ability, spatial awareness that allowed her to always find the shortest route, and the guts to never slow down no matter what. Any one of those skills would have been a pain on their own, but Fiska managed to have all of them. As Vento rushes past a corner, two female students make the turn, not seeing him in time. They squeal as he gets closer, but Vento quickly apologizes and simply leaps into the air, completely jumping over them. He makes a graceful landing behind them and continues bounding up the stairs. Fiska follows soon after him, and seeing his display and abilities, she smiles more in delight. Without effort, she bounces off the wall and ceiling to get past the two female students Vento passed by before continuing on her hunt for Vento. The two female students are frozen in fear, not quite sure if they really did just see Vento and Fiska pass by. Meanwhile, Vento and Fiska's chase carries on as they run up a flight of stairs. Vento groans in anger, calling out behind him that she was far too persistent. Fiska merely says that until he agreed to a duel, she would chase him anywhere and everywhere. Vento points out that that would be his whole life. With a terrifying look in her eyes, Fiska challenges him that if he didn't like her arrangement, he could try and lose her in their chase. Seeing her expression, Vento almost shrieks in horror. Vento frowns as he thinks of his options. If he increased his lightning output, he could possibly shake her, but it would be pointless if his body gave out from muscle pain later on. Having no other choice, he suddenly turns around to face her. Arm outstretched, he casts Flash. Fiska is forced to stop and try to shield her eyes as a blinding light takes over the whole corridor. When the light eventually fades, Fiska and other students in the corridor's eyes are momentarily blinded. Seeing his chance, Vento makes a break for it. He enters the nearest set of doors before turning and finding the doors leading to the library. He quickly enters and slams the doors shut behind him. Faced with the library's silence, he breathes out in relief that he cut it a little too close. From behind him in the library doors, he hears Fiska's voice calling out to him, unsure where to find him and still ordering him to have a duel with her. Vento makes his way deeper into the library, choosing to crawl in hopes of staying quiet. As he's muttering to himself about the inconvenience he found himself in, a person stood in front of him. They ask what was wrong since he was making so much of a racket. Vento flinches in shock at suddenly finding someone in front of him. However, the person leans down, and to Vento's relief, it was Luna. She smiles at him warmly, saying that he was overreacting and reminding him that he needed to be quiet in the library. Pleased by her presence, Vento breathes out a sigh in relief and softly apologizes. Luna says that since she was the only one in the library at that moment, she supposed it was fine. Changing the subject, she quickly asks him what happened to make him look like he was fleeing from someone. Vento vaguely says that he just got tangled up with a troublesome upperclassman, but his words only make Luna more curious and confused. With a rather horrified expression, Vento recounts to Luna that Fiska the battle maniac had watched his duel with Alina and got so inspired that she was now hounding him to duel with her too. Hearing his explanation, Luna agrees that he really was in a painful situation. That said, Vento asks if it would be okay for him to hang out in the library for the meantime. Luna agrees to the condition that he talk to her. Vento says that he would be happy to if that was all that it took. Time passes and they make their way to a table in the library again. Luna brings up that she was also in the crowd during his duel with Alina. She says that she was so surprised to see that lightning magic could be used as magic reinforcement. Vento says that it was just a little application, using the power of lightning to activate all the cells and electrical signals in the body, raising one's reaction speed to its absolute limit. Simple magic reinforcement could grant high-speed movement, but it couldn't enhance reaction speed. The true nature of the Kirin he used was to enable the optimal movement at all times through phenomenal physical ability and reaction speed. Luna suggests for Vento to accept the duel, saying that if he used Kirin, she felt like he could win against even Fiska herself. Vento quickly refuses, saying that using lightning magic was ridiculously taxing on his body and he wasn't too keen on showing all his cards that early on. Luna understands where he was coming from, but she points out that Fiska most likely planned on hounding him for the rest of his life if things kept up. Vento leans back into his seat, staring blankly at the ceiling windows above before slowly agreeing. Thinking about his options, Fiska would probably come at him again the next day. In fact, she would probably do it forever until he said he'd accept the duel. Not only that, he'd like to believe it wouldn't happen, but there was a chance that if Fiska was fed up with waiting, she'd attack him in the middle of class. However, if he did accept the duel, they could fight wearing the cross badges that prevented damage. Thinking it through, Vento says that he really had no choice. As he sits up straight, Luna tells him to do his best and that she'd cheer for him again. Vento jokes that although Luna says that she'd cheer for him, he thinks she just wanted to see his magic. With an innocent smile, Luna says that that was only part of the reason. Vento stretches his body and says that since he's decided to do it, he might as well get it over and done with soon. Getting up from his seat, Vento waves goodbye and thanks Luna for making him feel a bit better. Luna watches him go, saying that she'd look forward to his duel, but Vento tells her not to get her hopes up too high. Time passes and a new day starts in one of the dueling arenas. The arena is filled with excited chatter, much more than the first duel. In the battleground, Fiska says that she was happy to have a duel with him. Vento awkwardly rubs the back of his neck, thanking her hesitantly. From up in the bleachers, Alina is in complete disbelief that Vento was actually dueling. Number 4. Albert tells her that the duel was a chance for Vento, so they should support him. However, he suddenly gets an excited look in his eyes as Albert says that if he won, Vento would become one of the numbers. Alina agrees that that would indeed be amazing, but she still wasn't sure. Back in the battleground, Vento smiles nervously, unable to believe that Fiska was still sane for betting her title as number 4 on the duel. Fiska calmly tosses her blazer aside as she reassures Vento that it was fine because being a number was just decoration for her. What she really wanted was to feel the thrill of dueling someone strong. However, she points a finger at Vento and reminds him that if she won, he would be her playmate until graduation. Vento just nervously comments that she managed to say the most terrifying things. In a duel, both parties must wager something to prove their sincerity. This time, Fiska had wagered her position as number 4 of the academy. Vento knew that if he lost, he'd be stuck fighting Fiska forever. The referee asks if they were ready and Fiska and Vento give their go-ahead. The referee tells them to begin, and at the same time Fiska and Vento unsheath their swords. Fiska rushes in, hand-holding her sword steady. She swings her sword as Vento nears. She kicks herself up, propelling herself forward. With a crazed grin, she holds her sword up in front of her. The tip of the blade is within inches of Vento's face as she jabs it. At the last moment, Vento throws his head and whole body back to avoid the attack. Although it doesn't deal heavy damage, his dodge isn't enough to completely miss the blade and it cuts through his blazer. He's relieved that it missed. Nonetheless, Vento makes sure to put as much distance as possible between the both of them. Fiska compliments him for dodging, mostly happy that she was going to have a lot of fun in her fight with him. Lightning crackles all around Vento as he raises his hand and charges his magic. Pointing his hand at Fiska, he summons a lightning arrow. She snaps out of her trance in the right moment and the arrow misses her face by inches. It goes crashing into the wall behind her. Fiska comments about its fast speed and Vento commends her for dodging it well. Fiska brushes his comment away, saying that it was just a fluke, but she reassures him that she would be able to see it coming next time for sure. She adds that it would be a real buzzkill if the fight ended with a simple attack like that. From up the stands, Albert and Alina watch with concern. Fiska gets into position again, saying that she would concentrate. If she just let herself wait and see, she would probably get taken down easily. Her eyes darken. Immediately, she's surrounded by a pulsing black mist. Vento flinches as he feels the air change. He watches as Fiska's sword changes color and turns into the black blade. With another crazed grin, she attacks with After Image. She slams her sword down, a trail of black shadow in its wake. Vento's eyes widen before he sidesteps in the last second, the black trail of the attack missing him by inches. However, just as quickly, Fiska appears right beside him, sword ready to deliver a direct hit. Vento frowns, realizing that she was betting from the start that he would dodge that way. Fiska slashes her sword, an arc of black mist following her blade. But when the mist clears, Vento is nowhere in sight. He appears behind her, a few feet away from where he once stood. Fiska is surprised. She didn't think he could dodge even in such a short time. Meanwhile, Vento curses to himself. She had forced him to do something crazy right off the bat. The effort of the dodge made his knee throb with pain. Fiska turns to him with a small smile. She knew that she didn't need to hold back anymore. With black mist surrounding her once more, she tells Vento that she was going all out. Watching Fiska's magic activate all around her, Vento knew that if he kept protecting his body the way he currently was, he wouldn't be able to dodge all of Fiska's attacks. He had no choice but to play along. Fiska is happy with his decision, but Vento warns her to prepare herself because right now, not even she could keep up with him. Lightning bursting all around him, Vento disappears in front of her in a flash. He reappears right in front of her, leg outstretched to deliver a harsh kick to her side. Fiska grits her teeth as catches it with her forearm. The attack sends her flying a ways back. She twists in the air and makes a soft enough landing, but her uniform sleeve is tattered from taking the blow. Watching from the audience, Albert and Alina gape in shock at Vento's sudden speed. Fiska comments that Vento really was like lightning. She couldn't follow him with her eyes. Vento is annoyed that despite saying that, she was able to guard perfectly against his attack. He frowns. Vento starts to wonder if Fiska's sword style was self-taught. It was extremely unorthodox yet practical. Not only that, but it was supported by her shadow magic and incredible reflexes. If she could react quick enough even to guard the last move he made, the fight was really going to be tough. Vento needed to at least find and get into her blind spot. He breathes in before dashing in. With incredible speed, he makes his rounds around her, trying to find an opening. Fiska kept her eyes open, hand on her sword, but she couldn't keep up. At one point, Vento seems to stop just behind her. She immediately swings her sword back, but when the dust clears, Vento isn't there. Still stuck in her confusion, she doesn't notice Vento creeping up behind her. Having her where he wanted her, he readies his hand. Vento swiftly strikes the side of her body. Fiska clenches her teeth in pain from the attack. The badge Fiska carries cracks, but it's not enough to make the referee call for the end of the fight. Vento curses at himself. He hesitated and his hit wasn't deep enough. Fiska turns around and swings at him, but misses once more. Lightning suddenly covers Fiska's body and she finds herself completely numb. Vento seizes the chance and goes in for a punch, but he suddenly flinches and forces himself to move away. Just then Fiska swings at him. Vento is able to dodge, but her sword catches at his blazer and cuts at his own badge. However, it doesn't break either. Vento steps away from Fiska as she's surrounded by more shadowy mists. She clicks her tongue, saying that she thought he had finally let his guard down. Vento frowns, bracing himself for her next attack. He watches as she moves forward, the shadows clinging to her body, surprised that she could use it like that too. Vento realized that she was using shadow magic to forcibly move her own body, commenting that it was an insane move on her part. Fiska laughs, saying that she was just improvising, but it worked out surprisingly well for her. Up on the stands, Luna watches in amazement. Vento knew he could use his magic to enhance his body too, but for Fiska to pull it off just by improvising was incredible talent. Dashing forward, Fiska found that using her current skill she might be able to move even more powerfully than usual. Fiska leaps into the air above Vento and throws her sword arm back. She slams it down on Vento, but he's able to dodge. He delivers a kick, but Fiska blocks it using her blade, laughing wildly. Vento's eyes widen as she swings her sword back and forces him to retreat. As she pulls her arm back again, she casually says that she would call the move shadow manipulation. More shadowy tendrils envelop her as she forces her body to attack. The battlefield explodes as her shadows crash everywhere. Trying to get Vento. Vento grits his teeth, realizing that Fiska didn't even care that she was paralyzed anymore. As Fiska readies for another attack, Vento appears behind her. He knocks her sword out of her hand. It topples to the floor, but using her shadow magic, she easily picks it up from the ground and back into her grasp. She swings at Vento again. He's able to dodge, however, he stops just as suddenly. Vento finds himself unable to use his leg. Fiska smiles pleasantly as she uses a skill called shadow stepping. Just as the name suggested, she stood in Vento's shadow and now he was unable to move. Vento curses at himself as shadowy tendrils snaked up his leg. He didn't know she had a skill like that up her sleeve all that time. Fiska prepares to use After Image again, raising her sword above her. Vento crosses his arms above him, having no choice but to take the attack. Fiska's shadow magic comes crashing down on a shield of lightning as Vento uses his magic to protect himself. Their magic explodes all around them. Fiska laughs in amazement that Vento is able to block her attack. Vento comments that her attack was weighing down on him too much. Vento uncrosses his arms as their magic disperses. With Fiska in the air unable to dodge, he found his chance to hit her. Vento prepares to use Lightning Palm Strike, but Fiska senses the danger immediately. Without hesitation, she backs away from him. She says that if his attack had hit, the fight would have been over. Vento is at a loss for words as he stares at her from across the arena. From the stands, Albert comments that both Vento and Fiska had an insane ability to sense danger. Both of them didn't have a single clean hit after all their back and forth. Alina agrees, saying that it was practically the level of beasts. Alina frowns in concern and whispers to Vento underneath her breath, telling him to see the battle through and win since he was able to beat her. Back in the field, Vento and Fiska wait for each other's next move. Vento mourns that he couldn't hold a sword while Kirin was active, but he reprimands himself for making up excuses at that moment. Fiska asks him what was wrong, urging him to hurry up and attack. She was sure that he was still hiding more skills. Vento frowns, asking what made her believe that. With a pleasant smile, Fiska says that she could tell because that was what she was doing. Vento is caught speechless. Fiska says that if she showed all her cards too early, the fight would end right away, so it must be the same with Vento. For Vento, the fight put a huge strain on his body, so he didn't like it, but he can't deny there wasn't a part of him that enjoyed it. He turns to the stands and sees Luna watching. Vento could unleash the techniques he's learned with all his strength. There was no way that he didn't think the idea alone wasn't fun. He asks Fiska if they should kick it up a notch as the lightning all around him scatters. He activates phase 2 of his Kirin. Vento holds his arm up, lightning encircling him overhead like a storm. Fiska grins madly, having the time of her life. Vento and Fiska dash towards each other, however, a voice tells them that they've had enough. The two of them stop in time as a familiar light-haired girl stands between them. Vento grits his teeth as the girl stares him down. Fiska is in shock, calling the girl Selin. Almost immediately, the entire stadium erupts into shock, including Alina and Albert. Fiska immediately asks Selin why she was stopping the fight when it was just getting good. Selin calmly says that as the student council president, she couldn't permit the duel to continue, much to Fiska's shock. Vento is speechless as he watches Selin stand casually in front of them. The girl was Selin Tailknot. Not only was she student council president, but she was also number 3. Vento couldn't believe that she would jump into the duel herself to stop it. Fiska asks why she was stopping the duel. Selin frowns and points out that she had told Fiska numerous times that she couldn't wager her number during a duel. Fiska can only gape in response. Vento meanwhile exclaims, unaware that that was part of the rules. Selin says that she heard that Fiska was in a duel, so she came by just in case. She lets out a heavy sigh, seeing as things had gone as expected. The referee is struck silent as well. In a panic, Fiska stutters out that she would bet something else instead so they could keep the battle going. Selin turns to Vento, an interested smirk on her face as she waits for his thoughts. Everyone in the audience, including Alina, Albert, and Luna, waits on edge for his response. After a pause, Vento releases the lightning surrounding him and says that he was calling it a day. Fiska immediately tells him to wait as Vento turns around to leave. She asks why he was quitting when things had only started getting fun. With his sword back in hand, Vento says that his excitement's already cooled down. He says that if Fiska was going to change the stakes mid-match, they should just do the battle another day. Casting her a small smile, he says that he doubts he'll find anything more enticing than a number. Selene watches Vento walk away with a thoughtful expression on her face. Fiska tries to beg Vento to stay and finish the battle. She eventually groans and says that it was Selene's fault that it ended so prematurely. Selene calmly points out that it was Fiska's fault for failing to follow the rules, making the other girl unable to come up with a proper response. Selene then says that if Vento truly was interested in a number, Fiska would surely have a chance to fight him in the scramble battle. After thinking about it for a moment, Fiska finally sheathes her sword back into its rightful place, saying that Selene was right and she was getting a little too hasty. Looking at Vento's retreating form, with another crazed grin, she looks forward to her next battle with Vento. Meanwhile, as Vento leaves, he breaks into a cold sweat as he feels Fiska's gaze on him. Later on, back in their classroom, Albert praises Vento over and over. He waves his arms around erratically as he recounts that not only was Fiska one of the numbers, some of the strongest fighters in the school, but she was an upperclassman too. Vento remains quiet for a moment, his face buried in his arms. Eventually, he raises his head and says that it was only a fluke and Fiska wasn't exactly being serious either. Albert smiles sadly and says that it was still a shame because he thought Vento was finally going to get into the numbers. Vento sits up straight and says that there was no guarantee he would have won, so he wasn't quite disappointed or anything. However, as he says so, someone comes up behind him. Vento exclaims in surprise as Alina delivers a harsh kick to his chair. Vento asks her what was up with her, but Alina only scoffs at him before leaving the room. Vento is left completely confused. Vento eventually asks Albert what was up with Alina. Albert scratches his head before saying that she was mad that Vento didn't win. Apparently Alina had said that she wouldn't forgive him if he lost after just beating her in their duel. Vento sighs, saying that she just couldn't tell him that. Albert says that he understood how she felt. Albert would want the person who beat him to be the strongest too. Not only that, but the higher the person's pride, the more they would want it to be that way. Vento is speechless for a moment before he rubs the back of his head and apologizes. Albert asks him how the duel would have ended. Vento says he wasn't sure, but he had no intention of losing. Albert gives him a wide grin in understanding. Eventually, Albert walks away and leaves Vento to his thoughts. Vento knew that the next chance to fight Fiska would be in the scramble battle. It was a huge event where students fought to steal each other's numbers. If he could win, he could finally become one of them. Either way, Vento knew he needed to get better at using Kirin. Underneath the table and unseen to everyone else, Vento's legs were trembling. Time passes and one of their classes ends. Alina suddenly comes up to Vento, asking if he's seen Albert. Vento tells her that he didn't know before asking what she needed from him. Alina says that she was hoping to get back the textbook he lent him, wondering where he was now. As she turns to look for Albert, Vento stands up. He asks her if she wanted his help and she could consider it an apology for letting her down during his duel with Fiska. Alina was struck silent for a moment before she agreed and said that she would appreciate it. Alina and Vento walk down the school corridor together in search of Albert. Alina is sure that Albert hadn't gone far. As they keep walking, Vento suddenly calls out to Alina as she moves on ahead. When he has her attention, he awkwardly apologizes for not winning the duel, much to Alina's surprise. She's quiet for a moment before she eventually says that Vento did well for himself against number 4. She asks if he thinks he would have won if he wasn't interrupted, and without hesitation, Vento says that he does. Her face slightly tinted red, Alina says that she had nothing more to comment other than it was a close one. Vento agrees. Suddenly, he stops. Vento calls out to Alina to point out Albert at the end of the hall. Vento's eyes grow wide as he sees Albert laughing with a female student in glasses. Lost in their conversation, Alina leans over to Vento and says that Albert seemed to be having a lot of fun. Vento agrees with her observation, but as Alina calls out to Albert, there was a strange feeling taking root in Vento's chest. Albert turns to them as he suddenly notices them. Alina tells Albert that she was hoping to get her textbook back, and Albert apologizes for forgetting to give it back. Vento hesitantly asks about the girl with Albert. She introduces herself as Shiori Clover from Class B. Shiori asks about Vento, saying that she was there to watch his duel with Fiska. She compliments him with a smile, saying that a first year like him holding his own against one of the numbers was truly amazing. Vento awkwardly thanks her. Vento is confused, rather sure that she wasn't a character in the original Fairies of Fantasia cast. Noticing that the students were beginning to file back into their classrooms, Albert says that it was probably time for them to head back to their own class. He waves to Shiori, saying that they should talk again during break. Shiori agrees, waving back in goodbye. Alina and Vento gape at Albert in shock as they head back. Albert is wearing a bright smile the whole way. Vento throws an arm around Albert and asks what the whole deal with Shiori was. Albert explains that during his way back home when Alina and Vento had shown him around the capital, he had dropped his things and Shiori helped him pick everything up. Since then they've gotten a little friendly. Vento starts to sweat nervously as he realizes something. Alina suddenly pops up behind them, asking Albert if he had fallen for her. Albert denies it, but his face is completely red. He nervously scratches at his head and tries to stutter out a response, Vento and Alina waiting for his next words. Vento's face grows pale. Albert smiles before explaining that when he talks to Shiori, his heart starts to pound. Alina exclaims at his confession. Albert then urges them to head back to the classroom quickly, saying he had to give back the textbook before he forgot again. He walks ahead of them, still lost in his thoughts. Alina leans towards Vento and says that she's surprised, never thinking he was interested in that sort of thing. Vento is silent for a moment. Alina is walking ahead when she realizes that Vento has stopped. She asks why he was spacing out, but Vento brushes her words off. Internally, though, Vento feels a chill. Fairies of Fantasia was a story where Albert got together with the heroines and saved the world. But if Albert got together with Shiori, would he still be able to save the world? Time passes and Vento walks into the library. As he enters, he calls out and asks if Luna was there. Calling up from the second floor, Luna replies to him. Vento smiles, glad to see her, before saying that there was something he needed to talk to her about. When Luna asks about what, Vento says he wanted to talk about romance, much to Luna's confusion. Luna looks at Vento thoughtfully before asking him if he had hit his head or something similar. Vento thinks that her thoughts are perfectly reasonable, but he reassures her that he was completely serious. Luna agrees and says that they should take their conversation to the back room. Thankful, Vento says that he owed her one. Taking their seats in one of the numerous study tables, Vento clasps his hands together in front of him, looking stressed as he tries to put his thoughts in order. He starts off by saying that the story is about a friend of his. After a short pause, Luna repeats his words back to him. But she obviously doesn't believe that it's about a so-called friend. She definitely believes it's about him. Vento looks up at her, saying that it really was about a friend of his. Luna says that she'll just assume that was the case, implying that she still didn't believe a word he said. Flustered, Vento pushes that it really was a story about a real friend he had. Luna thinks about his words more. Suddenly, Albert's smiling face appears in her mind, remembering that Vento only had one friend. That's kind of sad, Vento. Finally understanding what he was trying to say, Luna urges him to continue. Thinking about the original Fairies of Fantasia game, Vento tries to keep things as vague as possible as he says that his friend had a marriage partner chosen for him by fate. However, Luna doesn't know that Vento is thinking of a game and thinks of Albert's real-world circumstances. She asks if Vento was talking about a fiancé and he says that it could be called something like that. Luna is rather confused, thinking that as far as she knew, Albert was a commoner, but she doesn't voice her concerns. For context, commoners usually didn't have arranged marriages since there was no need to have them as much as nobles did, who used marriage to strengthen relationships and power. Vento keeps going and explains that his friend had several marriage partners. He's of course thinking of the multiple routes a player could take while playing the game, but Luna takes it as Albert being in a harem, commenting that it was rather sinful. Vento doesn't realize it, but he's dead-ass destroying Albert's reputation for Luna. Passionate about the topic and completely unaware of how badly he was explaining things, Vento continues that his friend has recently fallen for a woman who had nothing to do with his destiny. Luna's expression darkens at the thought of Albert, who was already in a harem, leaving all his women for another girl, and she comments that he was the worst. Vento brushes off her words casually, saying that although that may be true, the problem has just started. Luna is confused. Vento explains that if his friend ends up with the new woman, the whole world might be destroyed. At the end of his story, Luna's face is completely cold as she stares him down. Finally, she asks him if he was just messing with her after all. In a panic, Vento stands up and defends himself, saying that he was telling the truth. Luna says that she could tell he was serious, but it sounded like a made-up story. Suddenly, she stops short. She then asks if he was trying to write a book. Vento is confused by the sudden question. She explains that that would make more sense, and if that was the case, she would be able to help. Vento reluctantly agrees, saying that they could go with that idea if that was the case. Luna asks what Vento truly wanted for his friend. Vento says that he wanted his friend to break up with the woman and end up with his rightful fiancés. Thinking about the scene, still with Albert in mind, Luna comments that the author was rather cruel, but Vento is only thinking about the true ending of the original game. He agrees that it is a rather cruel solution, but if his friend doesn't, the world would be destroyed. After a pause, Luna asks if the woman even liked his friend. Vento is confused. Luna explains that although Albert fell in love with Shiori, she hasn't heard Vento say that the two were already a couple. Vento realizes that she was right. Although the two seemed to be getting along well, he still didn't know if Shiori actually had feelings for Albert, so there was still a chance for Albert to be rejected. Based on his reaction, Luna comments that she hit the nail on the head. Vento thanks her, saying that it looked like she was onto something. She's glad she was able to help. As Vento heads out of the library, Luna calls out to him and asks to read her book once he was finished. Vento is confused for a moment before he agrees and says that she would be the first one to read it. Luna bids him goodbye. Later on in the capital, Albert and Shiori laugh together as they go on a stroll. However, as they walk, Vento and Alina watch them from behind a cart. Alina asks what situation they were in right now. Watching the couple through a pair of binoculars, Vento harshly shushes Alina and reprimands her, telling her not to talk so loudly or they might be noticed. Alina is unimpressed. She doesn't bother lowering her voice and casually says that there was no way they would be noticed from that distance. She asks Vento if he thought it was rather tasteless of them to be spying on Albert's love life. Vento agrees but says that it was necessary. Alina lets out a heavy sigh and slumps on the ground, saying that she didn't understand that she was getting dragged out after school all of a sudden just to follow Albert. From underneath her breath, she mutters that she thought Vento was asking her out on a date. Still watching Albert and Shiori, Vento asks if Alina said anything as her voice was too small. Alina reassures him that it was nothing and she was only talking to herself. Alina asks what Vento was trying to confirm. Vento says that he wanted to make sure whether or not Shiori liked Albert. They watch as Shiori goes to feed Albert from a skewer and Alina says that it definitely looked like she liked him. Vento says that they couldn't be sure yet because there was a chance she was just playing with Albert and leading him on. Before he could say anything more, Alina delivers a swift chop to his head with her hand and exclaims that he was overthinking. Alina asks why Vento brought her along in the first place, and he explains that if it was just his perspective, he would probably interpret things to his own advantage. Alina blinks at his words, realizing that for him to say that, Vento truly wasn't messing around. She takes her place beside him again and watches Albert and Shiori. As the couple continue to act sweetly, Alina asks Vento what he would gain if Shiori really didn't like Albert. Casually, Vento would personally gain nothing, but the world would be saved. Alina turns to him demanding a serious answer, but Vento argues that he was being perfectly serious. Alina is just left more confused. She goes back to watching the couple, but Vento suddenly finds himself watching Alina instead. Finally, Vento asks Alina what she thought of Albert. Alina asks why the sudden question, a tint of red coming to her cheeks, but Vento reassures her that it was an important question. Alina says that it was nothing special and that he was just a friend. For her, Albert was a nice guy, but she didn't think of him as anything more than that. Vento suddenly slumps down on the ground, leaning on the cart with a smile. Alina's face turns a shade more red, asking why Vento looked so relieved. Vento exclaims in shock. Alina says that just because she didn't have a crush on Albert, it didn't mean she had a crush on him. Vento reassures her that he knew that, and Alina turns her back on him with a huff. However, Vento blushes as he asks himself why he really did feel relief. He knew he should be happy if Alina and Albert got together, and yet that wasn't quite the case. Before he can ask himself more, Alina's voice snaps him out of his thoughts. Albert and Shiori were moving and Vento apologized for spacing out. They move away from the cart. As Albert and Shiori continue to enjoy each other's company, Vento and Alina crouch behind signposts trying to keep up with them. Around them, townspeople watch the two of them move, confused. Eventually, Albert and Shiori stop in front of an accessory shop. Albert points to a bracelet and tells Shiori that it would suit her. Shiori tells him that it would suit him too, much to Albert's surprise. Hesitantly, Shiori asks whether they should get matching ones, and Albert happily agrees. Meanwhile, Alina and Vento watch behind a box of crates. Alina coos that the couple were being so lovey-dovey. Vento is caught speechless as he watches them order the bracelets. Watching them look so happy together, Vento frowns as he wonders if he really had the right to get in their way. The conflicted expression on his face is clear as day and Alina takes notice. Alina eventually says that although she didn't know what he was so worried about, she repeats that Vento was trying to say that if Albert and Shiori got together, the world would end. To which Vento confirms. Alina then asks why Vento himself didn't just save it. There's a pause between them as Vento slowly digests her words. Alina says that only if the world really was going to end, but Vento is already lost in his thoughts. He realizes it was an actual option. However, just as quickly he wants to brush the idea off. He turns to Alina, making her confused. If he was the one to save the world, that meant one more thing. Vento breaks into a cold sweat as he realizes that he would have to romance the heroines himself. Chapter 10, Luna's Problem with Another Day in Class. Vento sits on his seat with a thoughtful look on his face. He thinks of seeing Albert with Shiori again, happily spending time together, and his frown deepens. He knew that their bond just kept getting stronger and stronger. Without context, he just looked very jealous. Vento would eventually have no choice but to brace himself. Letting out a heavy sigh, he slumps over his table. Someone suddenly comes up behind him. Alina comments that he was so gloomy this morning, and she asks him what was wrong. Surrounded by happy, chattering classmates, Vento asks her how he could be happy when the world could be ending soon. Alina frowns, saying that he was still going on about that. She wonders if he ate something bad. Almost whining, Vento asks what she took him for, and Alina's mouth ticks up into a smile. As Vento slumps on his table again, Alina takes the seat next to him. Vento eventually crosses his arms on the table, head buried in them, as he thinks of what to do next. During his time playing Fairies of Fantasia, he knew that each heroine in the game had her own problem, and solving their problems was the key to saving the world. Originally that was Albert's role, but things were steadily changing. Still rather lost in his thoughts, he turns to Alina and asks if she had anything she was worried about lately. She thinks about it for a moment before saying that there wasn't anything serious, much to Vento's surprise. Alina explains that ever since Vento called off the buyout, her father had gotten his spirit back too. He had even told her he was going to do his best. Vento starts to sweat nervously. Now that he thought about it, all of Alina's events in the game were caused by the original Vento. Since the player now Vento had backed off, her entire route had basically collapsed. Although his voice was rather shaky, he says that he was glad to hear it. Alina asks why he was suddenly wondering about something like that. When Vento fails to make a proper answer, she calls him a weirdo. Alina then says that there was one worry that she couldn't tell him about. Vento is shocked, but Alina turns her head away and brushes him off just as quickly. Vento starts to spiral as he realizes that a development like that wasn't in the game. He was rather sure that it was going to be difficult to aim for the ending through Alina's route. However, with Alina's face turned away from him, Vento doesn't see the blush dusting her cheeks as she frowns. I think her route would be the easiest for him actually. Time passes and eventually Vento asks the same question to Luna. He says that it could be anything and she could talk to him about it. Luna asks why he was suddenly asking. Vento starts to break into a sweat as he makes the weak excuse that he just felt like being helpful to people. With a suspicious look on her face, Luna points out that Vento had been acting a little strange since the other day, making Vento flinch. Luna adds that she understood that working on a story was hard, but she suggests for him to rest a little. Vento only now remembers that his explanation to Luna was that he was trying to write a book. She asks him if it was also part of his creative process. Taking his chance, Vento says that she was right and he was going around asking people all sorts of things for reference. With a satisfied smile, Luna says that if that was indeed the case, then she would be able to help. She explains that there was a book she had been looking for lately and Vento asks what it was about. According to Luna, it was a book on how to become able to use synthesis magic by the user's own. Vento blinks in surprise. In Fairies of Fantasia, Luna was the only one who could use magic of all the elements. Most characters were only able to use 3 elements at most. Being able to wield all 5 major elements was what someone would call an immense talent. That would explain why a how-to-use book probably didn't exist in their world. Vento tells her that he's never heard of a book like that. However, he knew that Luna would eventually learn synthesis magic, but it was a power that awakened from her desperate desire to save Albert when he was in trouble. Luna figured that Vento hadn't heard of it, which was why she was planning to go around to all the bookshops in the capital. Vento goes quiet. It was definitely different from the problem Luna had in the game, but he knew what to do. Vento asks to help her find the book if it was alright with her. Luna asks if he didn't mind and he reassures her that it was no bother. With a touched expression, Luna says that she would accept his offer. In the capital, Luna and Vento exit a building looking absolutely defeated. They've visited so many stores and still haven't found a single book. Their mission was going to be tougher than he thought. Luna comments that the sky was getting darker, so they should call it a day. Vento agrees and says that he would walk her home. Luna blinks in surprise and noticing her reaction. Vento asks if he had said anything wrong. With a blush dusting her cheeks, Luna reassures him that it was nothing. She looks away and thanks him. As they walk down the streets of the capital, Vento nervously glances at Luna right beside him. He noticed that she had suddenly gone quiet and wondered again if he said something. Suddenly, Luna calls out to him. She asks why he was so worried about her. Vento knew that he couldn't exactly say that it was because she was his favorite character. With an honest expression, Vento says that it was because she didn't avoid him from the start, or something similar to that. Luna is rather surprised that that was the only reason. Vento explains that it was a big deal to him since he was more than aware of his past misdeeds. It wasn't just Alina, he knew that the original Vento had hurt everyone connected to him. Vento tells her that he didn't think for a second that he's been forgiven, but it was a fact that Luna had helped lighten the burden on his heart. Vento laughs and smiles genuinely as he says that it was the reason he was so incredibly grateful to her. Luna stares at the bright expression on his face. After a while, Luna repeats that Vento had asked her if she had any worries. She tells him that she had one that was much bigger than not being able to find the book, and it was the only one. Vento asks what it was. Luna is about to say that it involved her processing of people's feelings, but before she can continue, she's immediately cut off. From behind her, a large explosion rings out. Everyone starts to panic around them. Luna is frozen as she realizes that the explosion seemed to have come from the direction of her house. At her words, Vento immediately starts running, telling them they had to hurry and check. They make their way down the streets as quickly as possible, following the trail of the smoke. When they arrive, they find Luna's house completely up in flames. They stand before the house, and while Luna is struck silent with shock, Vento seems to realize what's going on. A voice suddenly speaks up, saying that they had assumed Luna was inside the mansion when she had really just gone out. A cloaked figure strolls out of the burning mansion. They say that her disappearance had created a bit of extra work for them, but it no longer mattered. They declare that Luna was coming with them. Vento immediately throws an arm in front of Luna, shielding her from the stranger. With fear in her eyes, Luna asks who the cloaked figure was. The cloaked figure? A man with long hair and a shadow-like tattoo on his face apologizes for the late introduction. He tells them that his name was Sigurd, an executive of Nirvana. Luna asks what Nirvana is, but Vento cuts in and says that they were only a troublesome group that has been causing a scene as of late. Sigurd frowns and says that Vento was being quite rude. He tells them that Nirvana was a gathering of comrades united by a sublime objective, and that they were the very spokesman for a god's will. Vento frowns, knowing that it was most likely an evil god. Vento couldn't understand why an event from Luna's route happening now of all times. In the original game, this scene was where Luna was abducted and Albert rescues her. However, right now Albert and Luna had no connection to each other and Albert was spending time with Shiori. If Luna gets taken away at that moment, Vento had no idea what would happen. Sigurd turns to Luna again and says that they were in need of her, someone who possessed such a rare talent, and asking her to offer herself up to them. Luna says that she didn't understand what Sigurd was trying to say, but more importantly, her parents were inside the mansion during the attack. Sigurd all but brushes her words aside, saying that they could possibly be riding the smoke to the other side as they were talking. That's definitely one way to say it. Wordlessly, Luna drops to her knees in shock. Angered, Vento starts to glow with his magic. Sigurd smirks at him, amused. He didn't know who Vento was, but he suggests for him to quietly hand over Luna to Nirvana. Summoning the first phase of Kirin, Vento yells that he wouldn't do what he said, especially after hearing Sigurd speak. Sigurd isn't surprised to see lightning magic, saying that it wasn't particularly rare and it was hardly a significant threat. Before Sigurd could do anything else, Vento appears before him. He slams his hand over Sigurd's face and throws him straight into the nearest wall. Sigurd crashes through the bricks. Vento looks down at Sigurd, loosening his tie as he prepares for the fight. He mocks Sigurd's earlier words, saying that he was just an insignificant threat. Summoning his own magic, Sigurd picks himself up from the wreckage. He laughs and says that Vento appeared to be more troublesome than he looked. Chapter 11. Item Box. Vento frowns as he watches the space above Sigurd crack like breaking glass, a vast darkness inside the hole. Sigurd was a Nirvana executive, yes, but he was also the main villain for Luna's route. As for his magic, it summoned any object stored in a separate space. It was a skill called Item Box. From the crack made on thin air, numerous weapons floated out, all aimed at Vento. Sigurd promises to make him regret his decision. The numerous blades in the air all speed towards Vento, but he meets them head-on. The swords all impale themselves on the ground as they all miss him, and he goes dashing towards Sigurd. He raises his fist as he nears him. Before he can react, Vento is already in front of Sigurd. He's confused why his magic didn't even faze Vento in the slightest. But for Vento, an attack like that was nothing new to him. He throws a punch at Sigurd. Sigurd is able to dodge, but as he moves away, Vento is able to grab his wrist. He casts a spell that has the lightning circulating around him to flow right into Sigurd. Sigurd groans in pain from being electrocuted. As Sigurd tries to recover from the attack, Vento steps back and prepares another fist, hoping to knock him out with one more hit. However, as he rushes in, Sigurd raises his head and Vento hears a loud snap. Behind Vento, a large crack appeared in mid-air again, this time holding lanterns and oil. Before Vento could react, the area around him is engulfed in blazing fire. Watching the flames, Sigurd comments that Vento wasn't too bad. He smirks, commenting that he didn't expect Vento to be able to dodge the attack. Behind him, Vento lands safely, without a single burn on him. Vento wipes the sweat from his face. Sigurd was just full of surprises. If his reflexes hadn't been enhanced, he would have been a pile of ash by now. Suddenly, Vento looks up as Sigurd tries another attack. Something seems to loom over Vento. When he turns to the sky, he finds another large crack, a huge boulder coming out of it and right on top of him. Vento exclaims at the sight of it. Luna calls out to him in a panic. Sigurd smirks as he announces that he was going to crush Vento right then and there. Vento knew there was no way for him to dodge it, and that only left him no other choice. He activates Phase 2 of his Kirin. He fires himself off the ground and kicks the boulder with enough power to break it into 1,000,000 pieces. Sigurd exclaims in disbelief. As the debris showers down all around him, Sigurd is confused. Vento wasn't anywhere to be seen. But just when he thinks so, Vento appears right behind him. He throws the punch right at Sigurd's face, sending him flying one more time. Vento flexes his fist as he and Luna wait for Sigurd's next move. Sigurd groans in pain as he stumbles to get up, saying that everything was just a miscalculation. He admits that Vento was indeed tough, but just as he's saying that Vento was wrong for assuming he'd go down with just one punch, Sigurd falls to his knees. The world seems to darken and Vento is the only thing Sigurd could see. He couldn't understand what was going on. Vento mocks Sigurd for taking his single punch too lightly. As Sigurd feels paralyzed, Vento tells him that although he was barehanded, his punches were still covered in lightning. A single punch from him was all it took. Vento orders Sigurd to behave himself and surrender because he was steadily running out of patience. Lightning crackles all around Vento. Sigurd slowly starts to laugh, and when he opens his eyes, there's a slightly crazed look in them. He says that everything really was one big miscalculation. He almost couldn't believe that he failed his own mission. There's a loud snap and once more a crack appears. but this time it was right where Sigor knelt. Vento gapes in shock, realizing what was happening. As he goes to leap into the large crack, he tells Vento that he couldn't let himself be captured and so he would retreat for the moment. Before he completely makes his escape, he tells Luna that she couldn't escape Nirvana and they would get her, sooner or later. Vento immediately tries to go after him, summoning a lightning lance. He throws it into the crack, but all he sees is Sigur's smile as the attack misses before the crack completely closes off. Vento clicks his tongue in annoyance. He curses as the lightning around him disperses. However, his anger quickly disappears when a soft voice calls out to him from behind him. He quickly kneels down beside Luna and asks if he was okay. Luna reassures him that she was, however his eyes say otherwise as she looks back to the burning mansion and faintly calls out to her mother and father. This was the event where Luna parts from her parents without being able to say goodbye. Vento wonders if the heroine's fates really were that hard to change after all. Vento wraps an arm around Luna in comfort. In a small voice, Luna thanks Vento, much to his confusion. She holds on to the ends of his uniform as she says that she was glad that he was there to save her. Vento stays quiet, a frustrated expression on his face. He couldn't let himself lose his head while he was there. At the very least, he changed the fate where Luna was kidnapped. If it could be changed, then he had to try. At that point, only he was only to change all of their fates. The following day, back at school, Albert and Alina have varying expressions of curiosity as they stare at Vento and Luna sitting next to each other on a bench outside the school. They ask what happened. Vento only manages an awkward laugh, unsure how to proceed. Alina asks first if the girl was Luna and if she and Vento knew each other, leaving out the fact that she had already seen them together once before. Yeah, pretty sure it's best not to mention that you basically stalked them a while back. However, Luna quickly tries to hide herself behind Vento's shoulder, much to Alina's confusion. Vento reassures Luna that she could trust Alina and Albert. He asks her if he could tell them the current situation, to which Luna nods in agreement. Vento gives Albert and Alina a rundown of what happened yesterday, saying that a member of a group called Nirvana attacked Luna's house. The two of them exclaim in shock but let Vento continue. He says that he happened to be there so he was able to protect Luna, but his voice drifts off as he leaves it up in the air about what happened to Luna's parents. Alina has a horrified expression on her face as she realizes what he meant. Angered, Albert asks what Nirvana was after. Wordlessly, Vento glances at Luna. Albert understands that that was the reason Vento was currently staying with Luna. Vento explains that the attacker had magic that allowed him to move through space. He tells them that he's thought about letting the Knights protect her, but he wasn't sure if it would be enough, especially when he thought about their first meeting with Melfi. As Vento and Albert continue to talk, Alina's eyes are on Luna and Vento sitting together. There's a conflicted expression on her face. She's knocked out of her thoughts when Albert says that if that was the case, then he would lend a hand too. He suddenly turns to her and asks if she would help as well, but still lost in her thoughts, Alina stumbles over her words. Vento gives them a thankful smile and Luna bows her head in gratitude. Moving on, Alina says that still not knowing when Sigurd would attack again was still concerning, and Vento agrees. Albert calls out to Vento and asks whether he would lose if he fought Sigurd again. With a determined expression, Vento reassures him in complete confidence that he would win. Funny, I feel like I've heard that somewhere before. Albert then offers that he had an idea and tells Vento to stay with Luna for one more night. Alina asks what the plan was. Albert says that if the enemy was after Luna specifically, there was only one surefire way to lure Sigurd out. Crossing their arms together in agreement, Albert asks Vento if he would let him handle the situation, and Vento promises to trust him. Meanwhile, deep in what appeared to be an abandoned cathedral, Sigurd leans against one of the crumbling pillars. He groans in pain, wondering who in the world Vento was. Suddenly someone calls out to him, commenting how someone sure gave Sigurd quite the beating. A person with a pleasant smile and wearing a leopard print coat appears. Sigurd calls them Hakuna. Hakuna casually comments that they heard that Sigurd let the Witch of Colors escape. Sigurd tries to defend himself, saying that someone got in his way. Hakuna tells him to get it together because they could search the entire world and they would still never find another person like Luna. She was a prodigy who could use all 5 elements, after all. If they offered her as a sacrifice, someone called Lord Avon would be far closer to his revival. Sigurd finally slides down to the ground against the pillar. He says that he understood and he would make sure to capture Luna next time. However, he wanted Hakuna to heal him first since he couldn't do much in his current state. With a sigh, Hakuna agrees but says they would charge him for the effort. Holding out a hand to Sigurd's chest, they start to glow with their magic. A bright light encircles them as they heal Sigurd. Hakuna then says that they had gotten interested to hear about the guy who was able to give Sigurd a beating, and so they would come with him next time. Sigurd is surprised to hear their decision. Hakuna says that there was no reason for them not to, and since Sigurd lost, he didn't get to decide. They finish healing him and Sigurd thanks Hakuna. Eventually, Sigurd sighs and agrees with Hakuna. Crossing their legs together, Hakuna smiles, a sinister look in their eyes as they giggle. Vento and Luna walk down an empty street together. As they walk, Luna suddenly tugs on the back of Vento's uniform. She softly calls out to him, but before she can say anything more, Vento reassures her that he would protect her. Thinking deeply, Vento goes over their plan for protecting Luna. Albert suggests that they should bait Nirvana out. They were going to create a situation where they would be forced to strike. They continue to refine the details of the plan in the garden. Alina asks Albert if he thought it would really work. With a confident smile, Albert tells her that it would be okay because they'll be able to do it together. Vento's eyes widened at his words. Vento laughs to himself at the memory. Those words were the protagonist's catchphrase. He never thought he'd be able to hear it for himself. Vento is brought back to the present as Luna calls out to him again, much to his surprise. Luna hesitantly asks why Albert and Alina would be willing to help her, especially since they didn't even know her that well, which is a funny statement since all things considered, Vento doesn't know much about her if he didn't play the game. With a sad smile, Luna admits that she didn't really understand emotions, so to understand them, she read about them, and she thought she finally understood. However, even then, she could only think logically, not emotionally. She couldn't understand why Albert and Alina would want to help her. Vento's eyes widen in surprise at her words for a moment before he pats her head. Luna is shocked at the sudden action, but Vento only laughs, saying that it was because his two friends were kind at heart, just like Luna herself. Luna looks up at Vento with bright eyes, surprised he called her kind, similar to Albert and Alina. Vento doesn't turn to her as he says that not wanting others to get hurt was a trait he thought impressive. Luna suddenly realizes his hand is no longer on her head and seems to feel its loss. But she blushes and smiles at the memory of its presence. Suddenly, they hear movement coming from above them, and Vento looks up in alarm. They find a cloaked figure looking down at them. Luna is surprised they arrived so soon, and Vento comments that he didn't expect them to actually show up. Vento hears something from behind him and whips his head around. He realizes they were now flanked on both sides by cloaked figures. One of the figures produces a sword and orders Vento to hand over Luna. Vento demands to know where Sigur was, but the figure holding a sword says he didn't know who that was. The man introduced themselves as members of the Order of the Stars. He says that they planned on taking Luna to offer her as a sacrifice to the glittering constellations above. Vento exclaims in shock, realizing that the figures weren't from Nirvana. The man with a sword doesn't answer him, choosing to leap up from the roof. He pulls back his sword, preparing to attack. He slashes down at Vento, but he dodges in time, shielding Luna away from the danger. Vento grunts from the effort. The other cloaked figure silently summons a magic circle and a ball of fire shoots out towards Vento and Luna. Vento summons a thundershot to meet the attack halfway, causing an explosion in midair. Finding a safer spot and summoning out a sword, Vento asks Luna to stay right behind him. Not even a second later, the figure with a sword rushes up to Vento. Vento is able to block it in time, but he's shocked to find the figure rather strong. The two of them put distance between themselves, backing away to regroup. Soon, Vento and Luna are flanked again by the cloaked swordsman and the spellcaster. Holding his sword up in one hand and holding Luna back with the other, Vento says that he wouldn't go down that easily. Suddenly, a crack in midair appears right behind Luna, much to her shock. From the abyss of the crack, Sigur appears, holding out a hand to grab Luna. He tells the cloaked figures that though he didn't know who they were, Luna belonged to them. However, before he can grab her, a ball of fire is thrown right at him. He falls off the crack and goes flying from the attack. Before he knew it, he's flanked by the cloaked figures on one side and Vento and Luna on the other. He grunts from the pain. He mutters that the shot the spellcaster just made felt like it was ready for him to appear. Sigur realizes he fell right into their trap. The cloaked figures take off their hoods to reveal Albert and Alina. Albert tells Sigur that since he was from an organization, they figured the last thing you'd want is another organization taking Luna. Sigur chuckles, complimenting them for coming up with something so clever. As he staggers back up, his power radiates from his body, his expression menacing. Alina shudders and Albert agrees that Sigur was strong. However, Vento suddenly steps in between the two and Sigur, telling them to stand back. Vento apologizes before asking them to stay with Luna. Alina asks if he really wanted to fight him alone and Vento agrees. Loosening his tie, Vento crackles with his lightning powers. He tells Sigur that he was running out of patience and he was done holding it back. Sigur smirks, saying that they would finally settle things. He urges Vento to show him what he got as another crack appears behind him, more weapons coming out from its abyss. As the blades come flying towards him, Vento releases Phase 2 of his Kirin. The sudden burst of lightning has the blades scattering. Before Sigur could blink, Vento was gone from in front of him, leaving only the blades lying on the floor. Sigur hears Vento's voice from behind him asking if he was done playing with his toys, but as he turns around, Vento delivers a backhanded punch right at his face. Sigur goes flying at another wall, grunting from the impact. As he slams into it, Vento says that he wasn't done yet, and before Sigur could react, Vento kicks him right through the wall. He goes crashing into crates and barrels right into the wall inside the building. He grunts and coughs from the pain, struggling to stay upright. He internally exclaims at Vento's absurd power. Watching from the sidelines, Alina gapes in shock, asking if Vento had always been that strong. Albert can only laugh in disbelief, guessing that Vento really wasn't planning on holding back anymore. As Seeger continues to struggle in pain, but also still conscious, Vento comments that he really was tough. However, he was glad because that just meant he could hit him as hard as he wanted. Looking up, Seeger manages a small smile, saying that he wasn't planning on being his punching bag. A crack appears right in front of Vento, and a cannon is pushed out. Albert and Alina can only exclaim in shock before it fires and shoots at Vento. Seeger manages to make it out of the building, saying that at that range there was no way he could dodge it. But before the smoke could even clear, he hears Vento's voice say that he was able to do so. Seeger exclaims to find Vento standing on a roof just above him. Vento immediately leaps down, ready to deliver a kick right at Seeger. His attack lands, the heel of his foot knocking right over Seeger's head. The place where his foot touches Seeger's head sends an electric shock right into his body, and he grunts from the pain. Seeger is able to wobble away. Vento pulls back his arm, saying that he should have stayed down. As Vento nears him, Seeger is unable to do anything as he realizes he was paralyzed. He takes Vento's punch straight on and he crashes right through another wall. Flexing his fingers, Vento says that he warned Seeger what would happen. Sitting down on the floor, Seeger coughs and stutters out that he didn't think things would come to that point. In the company of his own friends, Vento says that coming out there on his own sealed his fate. Bursting with his powers, Vento gives Seeger his final warning. If Seeger surrendered now, he wouldn't take his life. Seeger smirks and says he didn't know what Vento was celebrating. He asks if he really thought he came there without a plan. Suddenly, a crack appears right behind Vento. A hand with leopard print sleeves reaches out towards him, but he disappears in the blink of an eye. Hakuna exits the crack, joyfully commenting that Vento was able to dodge him. He understood that Vento's reflexes are enhanced. Vento gapes in shock at Hakuna, not expecting him to show up so early. Hakuna goes over to Seeger, laughing that Vento was able to get him good. Seeger agrees, saying that he didn't even have the chance to call Hakuna. Vento thinks of his chances. In front of him were 2 Nirvana executives, but that was just perfect for him. If he could take out some of them there, things would be much easier. Hakuna understood that while Vento was around, it was no surprise that Seeger would break a bone or two. He offers to fight Vento together, and Seeger agrees, saying he was planning on a 2-on-1 battle anyway. However, much to Vento's shock, Albert suddenly steps in, saying he wasn't going to let that happen. Taking off the cloak from before, he says that he would help make the fight even. Hakuna hums in thought at his sudden arrival. Vento tries to say something, but Albert puts a hand on his shoulder and reassures him that Alina stayed behind to take care of Luna. They needed to focus on taking down Seeger and Hakuna. Vento grins, almost unable to believe how much of a good guy Albert was. Taking on a fighting position, Vento and Albert prepare to defeat the Nirvana executives. Chapter 13. As the 2 teenagers and the Nirvana executives watch for each other's first move, Alina holds an arm out in front of Luna protectively. Hakuna ponders about the idea of a 2-on-2 battle. He sighs, saying that he wasn't that big of a fan of messy fights and suggests that since they finally got to fight, they should do it 1-on-1. He adds that it makes things simpler. Vento flashes with his magic and Albert summons his blade. Vento coldly apologizes, saying that he would rather get things over and done with quickly. Finally, he makes the first move and rushes up to Hakuna. However, before he can even reach Hakuna, Seeger intercepts him. Opening a large crack behind him, Seeger tackles Vento before he can react in time. Seeger grits his teeth as he takes the full brunt of the electric current flowing from Vento and drags him into the crack. The last thing Vento hears before he disappears is Albert reaching out towards him. However, before Albert could follow into the crack, Hakuna gets in his way. Hakuna lets out a smile, sighing in relief. He's glad that it's 1-on-1 now, since he says it's the simplest way to go. Pointing his sword threateningly at Hakuna, Albert asks where Vento was. Hakuna only smirks, telling him to just ask Seeger, although he most likely won't be back for a while. Suddenly, in a flash, Hakuna seems to disappear into thin air. Hakuna reappears behind Albert. He swings at the back of his head, but at just the right moment, Albert dodges the attack. The smile on Hakuna's face disappears as he wonders what happened. Albert lets out a grunt of annoyance. He quickly whips around to face Hakuna, but the Nirvana executive jumps away a few meters back to avoid him. Hakuna smiles, amazed that he was able to dodge his attack. However, Albert frowns. He couldn't help but think that there was something more to Hakuna's attack. Smiling serenely, Hakuna says that maybe he underestimated Albert. He adds that he thought he would have an easy time without Vento around, adding that he really hated having to break a sweat. Albert smiles, rather amused that Hakan seemed to hate a lot of things. Hakuna asks if the idea bothered him. Alina and Luna are surprised to hear Albert admit that he just thought that it was better to talk about things that he liked rather than what he hated. Hakuna grins at the thought of Albert giving him advice. Chillingly, he opens his eyes, their stare sharp, and says that Albert was 100 years too early to be teaching him. Suddenly, a crack appears behind Hakuna, summoning the hobby cannon from before. He aims it right at Albert, who was frozen in shock. The cannon fires and an explosion shakes the grounds. When the smoke clears, Albert is a few meters away. He seemed to have jumped away from the attack just in time. He was confused and alarmed. He was sure that it was Sigur's magic that summoned the cannons before and wondered if Hakuna and him used the same kind of abilities. Not answering his question of whose magic it was, Hakuna only says that naive brats like Albert got on his nerves. People like Albert never tried to actually understand someone else's pain and only vomited ideals. However, Albert stands up and only says that he wasn't interested in whatever pain Hakuna was carrying, much to Hakuna's confusion. If given free will, Albert would have said he didn't care about Hakuna's trauma. Frowning at him, Albert asks Hakuna what type of pain excused taking someone's life. Hakuna's face flushes with anger. He quickly orders Albert to shut up. Summoning a magic circle in front of him, Hakuna says that he would make Albert to shut it. A large crack opens behind him and a hobby Gatling cannon comes out. Albert grits his teeth in panic. If he kept dodging, the city would eventually get damaged. He preferred not to alert the others, but he didn't have a choice. He quickly strikes the ground with his sword. Immediately, light comes out and surrounds him. A large magic circle forms underneath him, and the pillar of light shields him from Hakuna's attacks. Hakuna stares in awe, realizing that since Albert could use light magic, it would be big trouble for him. Still protected by the pillar of light as Hakuna's cannon tirelessly shoots at him, Albert glares at Hakuna and tells him that his attacks won't be able to reach him. However, Albert was still unsure about the nature of Hakuna's magic. Hakuna watches him with a sharp gaze. The beam of light surrounding Albert seemed solid, like it was tearing space itself. Since Albert had struck his sword into the ground, it should reduce his mobility once the magic's up. With that conclusion, Hakuna snaps his fingers. Albert flinches as a wagon seems to be rolling in his direction at top speed. It only stops when it eventually crashes with the pillar of light surrounding him. He finds out that the wagon was filled with flour bags, scattering its contents everywhere in the air around him and covering his view. Unable to see where Hakuna is, Albert can only hear his laughter somewhere around him. Hakuna mocks him, saying that he could stay there as he gets his hands on Luna. At his words, Albert quickly lowers the pillar of light and charges into the flower cloud. However, he stops when he's faced by a cannon. Hakuna smirks as he was able to fool Albert. When the flower finally clears, Albert finds himself surrounded by cannons on all sides. He freezes and all the cannons fire at the same time in his direction. Hakuna laughs merrily. Smoke pouring all around them, Hakuna says that Albert should have kept his mouth shut. Now all he had to do was go after Luna, although he didn't quite feel like it. However, Hakuna stops when he hears a voice saying that he wasn't done just yet. He quickly whips his head around towards the fire and smoke. Coming out of the wreckage was Albert. His clothes burned and he was wounded all over but still alive and ready to fight. Hakuna can only stare and exclaim in shock and disbelief. Albert admits that the moment the cannons fired, he realized he couldn't dodge, so he covered his body in magic power and reinforced it. However, he still took damage. Hakuna's voice is shaky and his smile wobbles as he says that Albert was pretty reckless. He mocks Albert for having what he calls a beautiful friendship, and asks if he was really going that far just for his friend. Albert raises an eyebrow, saying that if he was honest, he didn't know the first thing about Luna, and wasn't even sure if he could call her a friend. His words make Hakuna even more confused, and he asks that if they weren't even friends, why was Albert risking his life for her? Albert admits that Hakuna had a point, that there was no reason for him to risk himself for Luna. However, that wasn't the case for Vento. With a resolute smile, Albert says that since his best friend said he wanted to protect Luna, if he could help him, then he would. And he would risk his life, time and time again. Hakuna looks conflicted at his words, completely at a loss. He mutters to himself that even his own parents had abandoned him. He finally snaps and summons more of the cannons around Albert. Albert looks at the weapons coldly. In the blink of an eye, he disappears from the cannon's line of fire and appears right in front of Hakuna. He had figured out how Hakuna's magic worked. Albert tells Hakuna that he had learned something like lightspeed movement, although he was only imitating what he saw Vento do. He raises his sword and immediately slashes at Hakuna, wounding his shoulder. Hakuna curses and points a magic circle at himself. Albert was now sure of it. Hakuna's skill was time replication, or more specifically rewinding. He had rolled time back to when the cannon went off, and that meant that the carriage of flour from before passed there not too long ago as well. Hakuna laughs nervously, saying that nothing changed just because Albert figured things out. He points out that the wounds Albert made had already disappeared right away, so it didn't matter how much he hurt him. Albert points his sword at Hakuna, summoning his light magic and making the blade glow. Hakuna is blinded by the sudden harsh lights. Before he can react, Albert is in front of him again. He swings his sword and strikes him. Hakuna grunts in pain before healing himself right away. He tries to reason with Albert, saying that it was useless. Albert doesn't stop and slashes at him again. Hakuna does his best to heal himself again, telling Albert in a panic that it was useless. Albert slashes at him repeatedly, again and again. He says to Hakuna that although his body recovered instantly, he would burn more magic power each time. Hakuna is in complete disbelief of what Albert was implying. Albert says that although Hakuna could rewind time all he wanted, the magic power he spent doesn't come back. Hakuna panics at the idea that Albert was going to keep cutting at him until he was out of magic. As a final nail to the coffin, Albert adds that he trained his sword day after day until he collapsed. So if it was minutes or hours, he planned on keeping Hakuna company for days if he had to. Eventually, Hakuna screams and falls to the ground, exhausted from losing too much magic power. Albert stands over him for a moment to make sure he doesn't get up. Realizing that Hakuna had really passed out, Albert scoffs to himself, saying that the fight was easier than training on his own. He sheathes back his sword and walks away. Chapter 14. Meanwhile, Sigur holds on tightly to Albert as they dive into an endless freefall. Albert grunts in realization as he watches the surrounding darkness and glittering stars pass by them far too quickly. He could hardly believe it, but Sigur had dragged him into a subspace. Almost like he could hear Albert's thoughts, Sigur grins deviously. Vento knew that Sigur couldn't keep a living creature inside of the item box for too long. He needed to devise a plan to get back to where he came from. But as he looks up, or was he looking down? Vento watches as a bright light envelops them and they head straight towards it. A crack opens in midair and Vento and Sigur fall into a room with a high ceiling, old chandeliers hanging everywhere. Vento clicks his tongue, realizing what Sigur had done. He immediately pushes Sigur off of him. The two of them land on their feet on solid ground, taking on an offensive stance as they face each other. Vento looks around with an amused smile, asking where Sigur had brought him to. Sigur tells him that they were currently in the Nirvana hideout, or at least a hideout that Nirvana had no plans of using again. Sigur opens his arms wide, summoning another crack in the air. Again, blades of all kinds exit the vast space inside. He tells Vento that they were finishing their battle one-on-one. Vento smiles, amused, joking that Sigur sounded very motivated. With a wave of his hand, the blades go flying past Sigur and head straight for Vento. In an instant, Vento dodges each sword as they crash into the ground all over him, missing their target. Watching him be preoccupied by his attack, Sigur smiles. Vento really was agile, but that was all the more reason why he brought him there. Reaching into another crack, Sigur takes out a gem from the darkness. The gem shatters in his palm into a million pieces. At the same time, the hideout starts to shake, debris falling off the walls and ceiling. Vento looks around in alarm. Sigur calmly hangs on a chandelier, his arms crossed as he explains that he just set off the self-destructing artifact he planted in the hideout. I don't know why he had to flex by hanging from a chandelier like a bat, but I respect it. Sigur adds that he couldn't risk leaving anything behind that any intruder could find if they discovered the place. In roughly 5 minutes from when he activated the artifact, the entire hideout would cease to exist. Sigur's role was to keep Vento in the hideout until then. Sigur taunts him, saying that although Vento could try and run, he would just go and fetch Luna. Rather annoyed, Vento just scratches the back of his head and says that 5 minutes were more than enough for him. In an instant, he's right in front of Sigur, expression cold and his arm thrown back for an attack. With a punch infused with lightning, he delivers a thunderblow right into Sigur's stomach. Sigur goes crashing into a wall, grunting from the pain. If you tried doing a drinking game, depending on how many times Sigur crashes into a wall, we'd be dead by now. From the ground, Vento tells Sigur that he wouldn't let him lay a single finger on him anymore. Suddenly, the lightning crackling all over Vento's body disappears. Small streaks of lightning escaped, but they were almost all gone. Instead, tattoo-like markings appear around his eyes, very reminiscent of lightning bolts. His eyes seem to crackle with the same bright energy. Sigur coughs out blood, suddenly unable to move. He felt oddly pressured. The silence between them was terrifying, almost like their fight before then was nothing but a dream. Unknown to Sigur, Vento had activated Phase 3 of his Kirin. Before Sigur could even blink, Vento was in front of him again, leg raised and ready. Vento delivers a harsh kick that sends Sigur crashing into the numerous concrete poles lining the hideout. Until now, Vento had been releasing the electricity in his body so he wouldn't overload. But Phase 3 was different. By trapping the electricity inside his body, it boosted his strength even further. However, there was a huge backlash. Meanwhile, Seeger coughs, wounded on the floor and struggling to get up. He couldn't see Vento's movements. It wasn't just that Vento was fast, he was on a completely different level that his mind couldn't keep up. He looks up in a panic, starting to sweat nervously. He didn't know what he was supposed to do from that point. Vento loosens his tie, revealing more of the lightning-like markings all over his body. He tells Seeger that he couldn't take his time because of him, so it was about time for him to end things. Seeger barely reacts more than shock as he feels Vento grab the back of his collar. Vento flings him away with raw strength. Finally cornered, Seeger thought that if he couldn't keep up with Vento, then he had no other choice. He would hurry the collapse and bury him alive. Not gonna lie, he should have done that from the beginning. Multiple cracks appear all around him and he summons out multiple cannons, a spell called Hobby Rebellion. Seeger fires them all at once, but he's horrified when he hears a familiar voice behind him. Vento mocks him for being too slow. In an instant, all the cannons around Seeger explode. His eyes are wide with shock and disbelief. On his last straw, he turns around in a panic and begs Vento to wait. He promises to give up on capturing Luna and tries to negotiate with him, but he stops short. Vento suddenly grabs onto the necklace Seeger wore and pulls him forward. Vento floated before him, eyes deadly cold as he blankly apologizes, adding that he was still an ex-villain. Raising his leg, Vento drives Seeger head to the ground with his foot over his face. Lightning crackles all around them as Vento uses his abilities to strengthen the blow. Seeger crashes to the ground with a loud boom. He coughs out blood and is completely knocked unconscious. Vento lowers himself to the ground and checks Seeger's state. Brushing his hair back in relief, Vento says that he wasn't kind enough to listen to Seeger's begging. Eventually, back in the capital, townspeople stare with a mixture of shock and confusion. Vento breathes heavily as he drags an unconscious Seeger around by the back of his clothes. His body already felt heavy. Vento needed to get back before Kirin Phase 3's backlash caught up to him. I'm surprised he was able to make it all the way back to the city. His thoughts are disrupted when he hears a loud voice call out to him from the bridge. Vento looks up in surprise. Albert happily jogs up to Albert, but Vento flinches in shock to see the state he was in. He asks Albert if he was alright because he looked like a total mess. Vento turns to Luna and says that it was all over. Her eyes are watery and she suddenly runs up to Vento and hugs him, catching him completely by surprise. Luna tearfully thanks him for protecting her. Vento hesitantly returns the hug, his face turning red. He internally comments that Luna's words about not understanding emotions didn't last long, but he brushes the thought away just as quickly. Meanwhile, Albert teases Alina, asking if there was something wrong. Alina frowns and brushes his question off, adding that he better not talk to her right now. Albert just smiles and lightly apologizes. Alina tells herself that it really was nothing, but a stinging feeling grips at her chest as she watches Luna and Vento. Remembering Hakuna, Vento asks Albert what happened to him. Albert casually shrugs and says that he turned him over to the Knights. Vento blinks in shock at the news. He thought Hakuna was stronger in the game, but he quickly tells himself that the important part was that Albert beat him. He tells them that they should hand Seeger over to the Knights as well. He goes to grab Seeger, but his hand slips, and before he knows it, he's stumbling forward. Luckily, Luna and Albert are there to catch him in time. Supporting his body, Albert asks if he was alright. Vento reassures him that he was, and it was just a backlash from the technique he used. Not to mention he walked for who knows how long while dragging an unconscious man along. Vento remembers that the last time he used Phase 3, he couldn't move for a whole week. Alina sighs and comments that Vento was no fun. Holding Seeger up by a leg, she tells them that she would turn Seeger over to the Knights instead. Albert says that he would come with her. Albert quickly shifts Vento's body to face Luna. He asks her to take care of Vento, and Luna readily agrees. With an arm over her shoulders, Luna supports Vento and they walk away together. Luna watches them go with an odd look on her face, and Albert glances at her in concern. Finally, he speaks up, asking if she really didn't mind that Vento was going with Luna. Alina tells him to mind his business. She adds that she just thought she should leave them alone for the day. Her eyes are dull as Albert comments that she was too kind. She blankly disagrees, pointing out that she was too bothered at that moment. Unbeknownst to them, two cloaked figures were watching their group from the rooftops of the surrounding buildings. One of them comments about Hakuna and Seeger being captured. They note that the group was strong, especially Vento and Albert. She asks her companion what they should do and if they should kill them right that instant. The man beside her reminds her that the Knights were coming, so it was better that they didn't cause any trouble. The cloaked woman expresses her displeasure, calling it a shame. The man reassures her that it was only a matter of time before they killed Vento and the others. Anyone who stood in Nirvana's way would be crushed. One of them says that they were looking forward to the next time they met Vento and the rest. Suddenly, Vento flinches in alarm and he turns around in concern, eyes landing on the roofs of the surrounding buildings. Luna turns to him in concern, asking if there was something wrong. Vento goes quiet for a moment before reassuring Luna that it was nothing, but he frowns as he continues to look at the roof.